For thousands of years, the most powerful spiritual leaders on earth were women. Then Christianity declared war on feminine divinity, and it's been raging for 2,000 years. The same institutions that burned witches at the stake were actually destroying the last remnants of ancient goddess religions, where women ruled as priestesses, prophets, and queens. Those herbs that got women accused of dark magic. They were the same healing arts that had saved lives for millennia. The demonic knowledge that marked them for execution. These were mathematical, astronomical, and medical advances that women had developed and preserved through generations of mother-to-daughter teaching. So before we explore how Christianity systematically dismantled feminine spiritual authority, hit that like button if you want to learn the hidden history they don't teach in schools. And drop a comment if you've ever wondered why powerful women throughout history have been labeled as threatening or evil. Imagine walking into a world where the most sacred temples were ruled by women, where goddesses commanded the devotion of entire civilizations, where the keys to life, death, and divine wisdom rested in feminine hands. The statue stands broken in the museum, her limestone face worn smooth by centuries of reverent touch. Once, pilgrims traveled thousands of miles to kneel before her. Once, she was Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, goddess of love and war, the sacred feminine made flesh in stone. Her eyes, carved by Sumerian hands 4,000 years ago, have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. They have seen her temples torn down, her priestesses scattered like seeds on barren ground, her very name transformed from blessing to curse. She was not alone. In the beginning, before the witch, there was the goddess, and she was everywhere. The wind carries incense through the temple courtyards of ancient Sumer, where the first cities rise from the Mesopotamian mud like dreams made manifest. Here, in the sweltering heat of 3,500 BC, power wears a woman's face. The high priestess Enheduanna, history's first named author, lifts her hands to the ziggurat's peak, and her words become law. She speaks, and kings obey. She writes, and eternity listens. Lady of all powers, in whom light appears, radiant one beloved of heaven and earth. Her hymns to Inanna echo through temple halls, where sacred prostitutes, hierodules, perform rites older than memory. Here, sexuality is not sin, but sacrament. The priestess queens rule not just temples, but cities, commanding armies, decreeing justice, mediating between the realm of gods and the world of mortals. Their authority flows directly from the divine feminine, unquestioned, absolute, sacred. This is a world where women hold the keys to both life and death. Along the Nile, where the flooding waters bring life to the desert, another goddess reigns eternal. Isis extends her star-covered wings over Egypt for 3 millennia, her priestesses guarding mysteries that kings beg to learn. In the marble halls of her temples at Philae, women dressed in white linen perform healings that draw pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. They read the stars, deliver children, prepare the dead for eternity. Cleopatra herself claims descent from Isis, wearing the goddess's horned crown as divine birthright. The priestesses speak in languages that predate written history. Their knowledge flows like the Nile itself, ancient, life-giving, unstoppable. They hold the secrets of mathematics and medicine, astronomy and agriculture. In their hands rest the tools of civilization itself, but in the marble corridors of Athens, something new stirs. Even here, in the birthplace of philosophy, the feminine divine commands absolute devotion. At Eleusis, the great mysteries unfold in chambers where no man may enter without feminine guidance. Demeter and Persephone preside over rites so sacred that revelation means death. The Hierophant, always a woman, holds the secret of life and death, rebirth and renewal. The initiates emerge from the sacred chambers transformed. Cicero will later write that these mysteries give meaning not just to life, but to death itself. For 1500 years, the greatest minds of the ancient world, Plato, Pindar, Sophocles, kneel before the feminine divine and emerge forever changed. In the forests of what will become Germany and Britain, Celtic priestesses stand in groves older than Rome, their voices carrying prophecies that will shape the fate of nations. They serve no distant god, but goddesses who dwell in rivers, mountains, sacred springs. The Druids defer to their wisdom. Warriors seek their blessing before battle. Kings offer tribute for their counsel. Boudica rides to war with the blessing of Andraste, the goddess of victory. 60,000 Romans die beneath her spears, and for a moment, it seems the feminine divine might hold back the tide of empire itself. But empires have their own hunger, their own gods, and these gods have names like Mars and Jupiter, Mithras, and Sol Invictus. They are all male. The archaeological record speaks in fragments, pottery shards and broken statues, temple foundations and ritual objects. At Çatalhöyük, humanity's first city, goddess figures outnumber male deities 10 to 1. The excavated rooms reveal shrines to a great mother goddess, her arms raised in blessing, her body decorated with the symbols of life and death, creation and destruction. In Crete, the snake goddess stands with serpents coiled around her arms, symbols of wisdom and renewal. She holds dominion over the labyrinth, that ancient symbol of the womb, of death and rebirth, of the journey into darkness and back into light. The Minoans know no separation between sacred and secular, between feminine and divine. Their civilization flourishes for 1,000 years in peace, their art celebrating the female form as the vessel of the sacred. These are not mere fertility goddesses reduced to the function of their wombs. These are complete divinities, creators and destroyers, judges and healers, the keepers of wisdom and the weavers of fate. Inanna descends to the underworld and conquers death itself. Isis gathers the scattered pieces of Osiris and breathes life back into the dead. Hecate stands at the crossroads, holding the keys to all mysteries, all transformations. They are terrible and beautiful, merciful and wrathful, the fullness of divine power expressed in feminine form. In the hands of these priestesses lies knowledge that will not be equaled for centuries. They understand the movements of stars and planets, using celestial mechanics to create calendars that govern agricultural cycles, religious festivals, the rhythm of civilized life itself. They practice medicine that combines empirical observation with spiritual healing, surgery and herbcraft, psychology and pharmacology, woven together in seamless understanding. The temples are not just places of worship, but centers of learning, hospitals, observatories, libraries. The priestesses serve as doctors and judges, astronomers and counselors, teachers and administrators. They hold property, inherit wealth, command respect across social boundaries. In many cultures, they alone can read and write, making them the living repositories of human knowledge. The goddess Seshat records the deeds of pharaohs in the stars themselves. The priestesses of Vesta maintain the sacred flame that keeps Rome alive. If it dies, the city dies with it. The Pythia at Delphi speaks prophecies that determine the fate of empires, her words carrying more weight than the commands of kings. This is power in its purest form, not the power of the sword or the coin, but the power of connection to the divine source itself. The priestesses stand at the threshold between worlds, translating the will of the gods into human understanding, mediating between the sacred and the profane. But translation requires interpretation. Mediation requires trust. And trust, in the hands of the feminine divine, becomes dangerous to those who would centralize power in their own hands. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the patterns repeat with startling consistency. The goddess appears as the triple figure, maiden, mother, crone, representing the fullness of feminine experience from birth to death. She rules over the moon's cycles, the seasons turning, the eternal wheel of time itself. Her symbols, serpent and dove, owl and cat, cauldron and pentagram, carry meanings older than written language. She is associated with the color red, the red of blood, of birth, of the life force itself flowing through mortal veins. Red ochre marks the graves of Paleolithic burials, the earliest human attempt to ensure rebirth in the afterlife. The goddess bleeds with the moon and brings forth life in blood and water. She is the source and the destination, Alpha and Omega, the womb and the tomb. Her priestesses understand this mystery in their own bodies. They bleed without dying, create life within their flesh, nurture with their milk. They embody the sacred in ways that no male priest can match. Their very existence proves the divine nature of the feminine, making them living goddesses in their own right. But embodied divinity is dangerous to those who would claim exclusive access to the sacred. If the goddess lives in every woman, then every woman carries the potential for power that rivals kings and emperors. If the feminine divine is immediate, accessible, present in the cycles of nature and the rhythms of the body, then hierarchical priesthoods become unnecessary. The seeds of war lie not in the darkness of ignorance, but in the light of this terrible knowledge. By the time of Christ's birth, the tremors have already begun. Roman legions carry more than eagles and swords. They carry the concept of universal empire, of one law, one order, one God ruling all. The mystery religions that once flourished across the Mediterranean face competition from philosophies that promise simpler answers, clearer hierarchies, more organized power structures. Stoicism teaches that emotion is weakness, that the body is merely a vessel for reason. Neoplatonism places the divine in abstract realms, far removed from the messy realities of blood and birth, sex and death. These philosophies appeal to men who find the feminine mysteries threatening, who prefer their gods distant and their power structures clear. But the goddesses still reign. Isis worship spreads across the Roman Empire, her temples rising in every major city. The mystery cults of Cybele and Attis, Dionysus and the Great Mother continue to draw initiates. The old ways persist, adapt, evolve. The feminine divine seems eternal, unassailable. In Palestine, a Jewish preacher named Jesus speaks of love and redemption, of a kingdom not of this world. His followers include women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, who travel with him, support his mission, witness his resurrection. For a brief moment, it seems that the new faith might honor the sacred feminine alongside the sacred masculine. But Jesus dies, and his apostles argue. Paul of Tarsus, who never knew the living Christ, begins to write letters that will reshape Christianity for millennia. Women should be silent in churches. They should not teach or hold authority over men. They are the weaker vessel, more easily deceived, the inheritors of Eve's sin. The war has begun, though few recognize it yet. The weapons are not swords but words, not armies but arguments, not conquest but conversion. And the first casualty, as always, will be truth. The statue of Inanna stands broken in the museum, her face worn smooth by centuries of reverent touch. But her eyes still hold their ancient knowledge, their terrible wisdom. She remembers when God spoke through women's voices, when the sacred feminine ruled the world. She remembers what was lost, and perhaps in her limestone silence, she remembers what might yet be found again. The wind shifts, carrying new scents. Not incense now, but smoke. The temples are burning. The priestesses scatter. The goddesses themselves prepare for a long exile, a journey into darkness that will last 2,000 years. But goddesses do not die, they only sleep, and sometimes they dream of vengeance. The forest holds its breath as the cross penetrates its darkness. In the sacred grove of Nemi, where Diana's priests have slaughtered each other for centuries in ritual combat to claim the goddess's favor, the last Rex Nemorensis falls not to a challenger's blade, but to Constantine's edict. His blood seeps into earth that has drunk the offerings of desperate pilgrims since Rome was built on 7 hills, since the Latins first learned to read omens in the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrificed beasts. But the grove does not die with its priest. It simply learns to wear different faces, to speak in tongues that bishops cannot understand, to hide its ancient hungers beneath new names that sound Christian to ears that have forgotten how to listen for older truths. This is where the horned god begins his long transformation from protector to predator, from life-giver to soul-stealer, from the sacred masculine that blessed fertility and growth to the diabolic presence that tempts mortals away from salvation. The change starts in the forests, where civilization has always feared to tread, where the wild things dwell that remind humans they are animals touched by divinity rather than angels trapped in flesh. The Celtic Cernunnos sits cross-legged in the shadows of ancient oaks, his antlers branching toward stars that remember when the world was young. Around him, the animals gather as they have always gathered: stag and serpent, boar and wolf, creatures that know no law but the law of seasons, no morality but the morality of survival, no sin but the sin of forgetting their place in the endless dance of predator and prey. He is the lord of the liminal spaces, the god who rules the boundaries between tame and wild, between human and animal, between the civilized world of laws and customs and the primal realm where only strength and cunning determine who lives and who dies. His worship is the gasp of lovers in moonlit glades, the blood of hunters who honor their prey, the sweat of farmers who plant by moon phases and harvest by signs that priests dismiss as pagan superstition. But superstition, the missionaries learn, has a way of proving itself through results that orthodox theology cannot explain or duplicate. The crops planted according to Cernunnos' calendar thrive where Christian agriculture fails. The hunters who make offerings to the horned god return with meat, while those who trust only in prayer go hungry. The women who invoke his blessing in childbirth survive where those who rely solely on saints' intercession perish in their blood. The practical success of pagan practices creates a theological problem that requires an ingenious solution. If the old gods are false, why do their rituals work? If they are demons, why do they grant blessings rather than curses? The answer that emerges from monastery scriptoriums and episcopal councils reshapes the entire understanding of supernatural power. The old gods are indeed demons, but demons who are cunning enough to offer temporary benefits in exchange for eternal damnation. Satan, the theologians explain, is a master of deception who can appear even as an angel of light. The fertility god who brings abundant harvests is actually the devil in disguise, offering material prosperity to seduce souls away from spiritual salvation. The horned deity who blesses hunters with successful kills is actually a fallen angel who feeds on the blood sacrifices offered in his name. This theological innovation allows Christian authorities to acknowledge the effectiveness of pagan practices while condemning them as spiritually dangerous. It explains why the old religions continue to attract followers even after their official suppression. Not because they are true, but because they are traps set by the great deceiver, who understands that humans are more easily tempted by success than by suffering. The transformation of the horned god from deity to demon requires careful attention to iconographic detail. Medieval artists study the old images with the dedication of forensic investigators, analyzing every element of pagan symbolism to understand how it can be redeployed in service of Christian truth. Cernunnos' antlers, once symbols of his lordship over the animal kingdom, become proof of his bestial nature. The early devil appears with small horns, almost human in form. But as centuries pass and the memory of the original god fades, the horns grow larger, more elaborate, more obviously animal. By the high medieval period, Satan has acquired not just the antlers of the stag, but the horns of the goat, the ram, the bull, a composite creature that brings together all the animals that fertility religions held sacred. The god's cross-legged posture, once indicating his role as mediator between heaven and earth, becomes the mocking pose of Baphomet, the idol that later ages will claim the Templars worship in their secret rites. His nudity, once celebrating the sacredness of the body and its natural functions, becomes evidence of his shameless carnality. His association with serpents, once representing wisdom and transformation, becomes proof of his kinship with the snake that tempted Eve in Eden. But the most profound transformation occurs in the understanding of what the horned god represents. In pagan thought, he embodied the integration of human and animal nature, the recognition that consciousness and instinct must work together rather than in opposition. He taught that the body is not the enemy of the spirit, but its partner in the dance of existence, that desire is not corruption, but sacred energy that connects mortals to the creative force of the universe. Christian theology cannot accommodate such integration without undermining its fundamental dualism between flesh and spirit, between the temporal world that must be transcended and the eternal realm where true life begins. The horned god must therefore become the enemy of all spiritual aspiration, the tempter who seeks to trap souls in material existence through the false promises of sensual pleasure. This demonization of the body and its desires creates a new kind of horror that pagan cultures never knew: the fear of one's own nature, the sense that the very impulses that ensure survival and reproduction are actually temptations sent by the devil to lead souls to damnation. The young man who feels desire becomes suspect to himself. The woman who enjoys physical pleasure risks being seen as Satan's accomplice. The simple act of being human in a physical body becomes a spiritual minefield where every natural impulse might be a trap set by the enemy of all that is holy. The psychological consequences of this transformation will echo through centuries of Christian culture. The repression of natural instincts does not eliminate them, but drives them underground, where they fester and grow monstrous. The horned god, who was once openly honored, becomes the demon who appears in dreams, nightmares, and confessional testimonies of those who struggle to live according to standards that deny fundamental aspects of human nature. Pan, the Greek god of shepherds and wild places, undergoes his own metamorphosis with similar results. In classical literature, he was a figure of both comedy and terror, a deity who could inspire panic in travelers who encountered him in lonely places, but also the god who protected flocks and taught humans the music that makes stones dance and rivers change their courses. His reed pipes, fashioned from the nymph Syrinx who transformed herself into marsh reeds to escape his amorous pursuit, carried within their music the eternal dialogue between pursuit and flight, desire and resistance, the masculine principle that seeks union and the feminine principle that maintains autonomy. His worship was not the solemn ceremony of temple religion, but the wild celebration of seasonal festivals, where normal social boundaries dissolved in wine and music and the holy madness that connects mortals to divine ecstasy. But ecstasy itself becomes suspect in a religious system that values control above all other virtues. The Christian who loses himself in divine rapture must be carefully supervised by ecclesiastical authorities to ensure that his experience comes from God rather than the devil. Unsupervised religious enthusiasm becomes evidence of demonic possession rather than divine inspiration. Pan's transformation into Satan follows the same iconographic progression as Cernunnos's metamorphosis. His goat legs, once signs of his kinship with the animals he protected, become proof of his bestial corruption. His horns multiply and grow. His reed pipes become the music that summons witches to their sabbaths. His laughter, once the sound of divine joy at the beauty of existence, becomes the mocking of devils who delight in human damnation. The process accelerates during the great witch trials of the early modern period, when inquisitors compile detailed descriptions of the devil's appearance based on the testimony of accused witches. Their accounts read like a catalogue of fertility god attributes. He appears as a great black goat, walking upright upon his hind legs, with horns upon his head and a beard upon his chin. His eyes burn like coals, his breath smells of brimstone, and his hooves strike fire from the stones wherever he walks. But the most significant detail in these accounts is often overlooked by modern readers who focus on the obviously fantastic elements. The devil, described by witch trial testimony, is not a distant theological abstraction, but an intimate presence who appears to his followers as a lover, a protector, a provider of the very things that fertility gods have always offered. Abundant harvests, successful hunts, protection from enemies, healing from disease, guidance through the dangerous passages of birth and death. The Sabbath confessions describe rituals that would be familiar to any student of ancient fertility religion: communal feasting, ecstatic dancing, sexual union with divine beings, the sharing of power and knowledge between human and supernatural participants. The only difference is the theological interpretation imposed by inquisitors who see diabolic deception where earlier ages saw divine blessing. Isabella Gowrie, burned in Edinburgh in 1595 for the crime of witchcraft, confesses under torture to meetings with a horned figure who taught her the healing properties of herbs, showed her how to ease difficult childbirths, protected her family from plague and famine. To the judges who condemn her, this is clear evidence of diabolic pact. To an anthropologist studying fertility religion, it sounds like a perfectly normal relationship between a priestess and her patron deity. The witch trials themselves become a kind of grotesque archaeology of suppressed paganism, excavating from the collective unconscious the remnants of religious systems that official Christianity thought it had successfully eliminated. The confessions extracted by torture reveal not just individual psychoses, but the persistence of entire theological frameworks that survived underground for centuries after their public suppression. But the most remarkable survival occurs not in human testimony, but in the artwork that decorates Christian buildings. The Green Man, that foliate face that peers from between stone leaves with eyes that hold forest wisdom, appears carved in hundreds of medieval churches and cathedrals across Europe. His vine-wrapped features grin from corbels and capitals, door frames and choir stalls, in buildings dedicated to the worship of a god who supposedly conquered all pagan deities. The masons who carved these figures claimed they were merely decorative, meaningless ornaments that filled empty spaces in architectural schemes. The bishops who approved their placement insisted they represented the victory of Christianity over paganism, grotesques that reminded the faithful of the chaos that existed before Christ brought order to the world. But the faces themselves tell a different story. They are not defeated or diminished, but vital and knowing, not cowering in shame, but smiling with secret wisdom. They represent not Christianity's victory over paganism, but paganism's survival within Christianity, the integration of natural spirituality into the very architecture of the new faith. The Green Man embodies all the qualities that Christianity officially rejected but could not entirely suppress: the sacredness of the natural world, the divinity that flows through leaf and branch and root, the understanding that God's presence is not confined to churches and scriptures, but permeates every aspect of creation. He is the horned God made acceptable to Christian sensibilities, stripped of his explicitly pagan associations, but retaining his essential nature as the divine masculine principle that ensures fertility and growth. The seasonal festivals that honor the turning of the year undergo similar transformations, becoming Christian celebrations that preserve pagan forms while accepting Christian interpretations. Beltane, the Celtic fire festival that celebrated the marriage of earth and sky, becomes May Day, ostensibly a secular celebration, but still centering on fertility symbols. The maypole that represents the cosmic axis, the flower crowns that honor the goddess in her spring aspect, the ritual dancing that invokes the sacred marriage between opposing principles. The May King and Queen who rule the celebrations carry within their flower crowns and green garments the memory of the horned god and his consort, the divine couple whose union ensures the fertility of fields and flocks. They may be chosen by lot rather than divine inspiration, may rule for a day rather than a sacred year, may kiss rather than consummate their symbolic marriage. But the essential pattern persists, the recognition that human community requires connection to the natural cycles that govern all life, that fertility must be honored and celebrated rather than feared and suppressed. Lugnasad, the harvest festival that celebrated the first fruits of the grain harvest, becomes Lammas, a Christian celebration that blesses bread made from new wheat. The loaves brought to church for blessing carry within their golden crust the same gratitude that ancient peoples offered to the grain gods who died and were reborn with each growing season. The prayers may be addressed to Christ rather than Lu, but the bread itself remembers older hungers, older satisfactions, older understandings of how divine sacrifice enables mortal survival. Halloween preserves perhaps the most complete transformation of pagan festival into Christian celebration and then into secular holiday. Samhain, the Celtic New Year that marked the time when the veil between worlds grew thin and the dead returned to visit their living descendants, becomes All Hallows' Eve, the night before the Christian commemoration of All Saints. But the essential elements persist with remarkable fidelity, the understanding that certain times are more spiritually active than others, that the dead maintain interest in the affairs of the living, that offerings of food and drink can maintain beneficial relationships with supernatural beings. The jack-o'-lantern that grins from modern porches carries within its flickering flame the memory of the sacred fires that once guided ancestral spirits back to their earthly homes. The trick-or-treaters who demand candy in exchange for good behavior reenact the ancient practice of offering hospitality to supernatural visitors whose goodwill must be maintained through proper etiquette. Even the monsters and demons that populate contemporary Halloween celebrations represent not the triumph of evil, but the domestication of the otherworld, the transformation of spiritual powers that were once genuinely feared and respected into entertainment that children can safely encounter. But the most profound survival of horned god worship occurs not in public festivals, but in private practices that continue to honor the divine masculine principle that ensures fertility and protection. The farmer who still pours beer at the base of the oak tree before beginning harvest may call it tradition rather than worship, but the oak receives the offering with the same beneficence it has always shown to those who remember the proper courtesies. The hunter who leaves tobacco for the spirits of the animals he kills may deny any pagan beliefs, but his actions demonstrate the persistence of the understanding that taking life requires acknowledgement of the powers that govern the relationship between predator and prey. The gardener who plants by moon phases and harvests by planetary influences may claim to follow scientific principles, but her methods preserve wisdom that stretches back to times when humans knew themselves to be participants in rather than masters of the natural world. Even the sexual revolution of the 20th century can be understood as a return to pre-Christian understandings of the body and its desires. The rejection of sexual shame, the celebration of physical pleasure, the recognition that erotic energy can be sacred rather than sinful. All of these represent the return of values that fertility religions took for granted, but that Christian civilization spent centuries trying to suppress. The environmental movement that emerges in the same period draws much of its spiritual energy from the return of horned god consciousness. When activists chain themselves to ancient trees to prevent clear-cutting, they invoke the same protective spirits that Celtic druids honored in their sacred groves. When protesters gather at sites proposed for development, they serve the same land deities that Germanic tribes consulted before making major changes to the landscape. The deep ecology movement that sees intrinsic value in natural systems regardless of their utility to human beings represents a return to animistic consciousness that recognizes spiritual presence in mountains and forests, rivers and wetlands. This is not primitive superstition but sophisticated spiritual ecology, the understanding that human well-being depends on maintaining proper relationships with the more than human world that provides the context for all earthly existence. Carl Jung, writing with the clinical precision of psychological analysis, identifies what the medieval church could not acknowledge. The gods have become diseases. Zeus no longer rules Olympus, but rather the solar plexus. But diseases, Jung understands, are often merely life force flowing through unrecognized channels. The horned god who has been repressed into pathology can be restored to his proper place in the psyche's ecology through conscious recognition and integration. Modern therapeutic techniques that incorporate wilderness experience, that use drumming and dancing to access altered states of consciousness, that encourage clients to explore their animal nature and instinctual wisdom, all represent the return of shamanic practices that honor the horned god's domain. They recognize that psychological wholeness requires integration of civilized and wild aspects of personality, that healing often requires temporary abandonment of rational control in favor of surrender to deeper rhythms that govern both individual and collective well-being. The men's movement that emerges in the late 20th century explicitly seeks to reclaim the wild man, the inner masculine that has been domesticated into social roles but retains connection to primal sources of strength and wisdom. When men gather in drum circles and sweat lodges, when they seek initiation experiences in wilderness settings, when they explore warrior archetypes and tribal masculinity, they attempt to recover what the horned god always represented: the integration of strength and tenderness, of protective violence and nurturing care, of sexual power and spiritual wisdom. But perhaps the most significant return of horned god consciousness appears in the growing recognition that environmental crisis requires not just technological solutions, but spiritual transformation, a fundamental shift in how human beings understand their relationship to the natural world. The climate crisis, biodiversity loss, pollution of air and water and soil, all of these symptoms point to the same underlying cause: the alienation from nature that results from demonizing the spiritual traditions that taught humans to see themselves as participants in, rather than masters of the natural order. The horned god returns not as an object of worship, but as a symbol of the consciousness that recognizes divinity in the natural world, that sees spiritual presence in forests and rivers and mountains, that understands human beings as animals blessed with consciousness rather than spirits trapped in flesh. This consciousness does not require belief in literal gods, but rather recognition of the sacred dimension of existence that reveals itself in the beauty and complexity of the natural world. The forest that once held its breath as the cross penetrated its darkness begins to exhale again. In wilderness areas protected by environmental legislation, in urban parks where ancient trees survive among concrete and steel, in gardens where people remember how to grow food in harmony with natural cycles, the green world reasserts its claim to spiritual significance. The horned god rises from his long exile, not as the devil who tempts souls to damnation, but as the life force that connects all beings in the web of existence. He wears new faces: the environmentalist who fights to protect old-growth forests, the permaculturist who designs agricultural systems that work with, rather than against natural processes, the wilderness guide who teaches city dwellers to see the sacred in wild places. His horns no longer mark him as demon, but as the crown of the sacred masculine that blesses rather than curses, that protects rather than destroys, that teaches humans to honor their animal nature while developing their spiritual potential. He is not the enemy of consciousness, but its oldest ally. not the opponent of civilization, but its necessary foundation, not the tempter who leads souls astray, but the guide who shows them the way home to the natural world from which they have been too long estranged. The cross penetrated the forest darkness, and for 1,000 years the shadows seemed to swallow the light of the old gods. But darkness, as any ecologist knows, is not the absence of life, but its secret nursery, the fertile void where seeds await the proper conditions for germination. The horned god slept in the shadows, dreaming of the day when humans would remember that they need not choose between spirit and nature, between consciousness and instinct, between the sacred and the wild. That day arrives, not with trumpets and visions, but with the quiet recognition that the same energy that moves in wind and water, that blooms in flowers and grows in trees, that runs in the blood of animals and the sap of plants, also flows through human hearts that have learned once again to beat in rhythm with the greater heart of the living world. The horned god returns not as conqueror, but as teacher, offering not dominion, but partnership, promising not power over nature, but participation in the sacred marriage between consciousness and life that makes both individual fulfillment and collective survival possible. He stands at the edge of the forest, with antlers branching towards stars, waiting for those who are ready to remember what their ancestors knew, that the divine and the natural are not opposites, but different faces of the single mystery that encompasses all existence in its beautiful, terrible, endlessly creative embrace. The serpent's wisdom dies with the sound of crushing bone. In the temple at Delphi, where the Pythia has inhaled sacred vapors and spoken prophecy for 1,000 years, the last priestess of Apollo feels the earth snake stirring beneath her tripod. The python writhes in the depths of the oracle's cave, its ancient coils embracing the fissure from which divine madness rises like incense burned on altars older than Troy. But when Emperor Theodosius closes the temple in 393 AD, the serpent's voice falls silent, its oracular whispers replaced by the single tone of Christian orthodoxy that tolerates no rival visions of truth. The snake that once embodied wisdom becomes the symbol of deception. The woman who once spoke for gods becomes the vessel of demonic delusion. The sacred feminine that governed birth and death, prophecy and healing, love and war, transforms into the ultimate enemy of salvation. Not Satan himself, but his first and most successful recruit, the seductress whose very existence threatens the purity of souls seeking heaven. This is where the most profound transformation begins, in the reimagining of the feminine divine from source of life to agent of spiritual death, from the creative principle that births both gods and mortals to the destructive force that leads them all to damnation. The change cuts deeper than theology into the unconscious structures that govern how human beings understand the relationship between consciousness and creation, between knowledge and desire, between the body that bears life and the spirit that transcends it. Hecate stands at the crossroads where three paths meet, her torches illuminating the darkness that surrounds all human choices. In one hand, she holds the keys that unlock the doors between worlds. In the other, the daggers that cut the threads connecting life to death. She is the goddess of thresholds, the divine midwife who assists in all transformations, who guides souls through the dangerous passages of birth and death, madness and revelation, ignorance and wisdom. Her worship spans continents and millennia. In Aegina, sailors leave offerings at her shoreline shrines before embarking on voyages that may take them beyond the edge of the known world. In Rome, wealthy matrons maintain household altars where her triple form receives nightly oblations of bread and wine. In the mystery schools of Alexandria, initiates invoke her protection as they descend into the underworld of their own psyches, seeking the hidden knowledge that transforms mortals into something approaching divine. but transformation itself becomes suspect in a religious system that preaches the perfection of divine revelation. If God has spoken the final word through scripture and tradition, what need do mortals have for the dangerous journeys that promise personal gnosis? If salvation comes through faith rather than knowledge, why seek the keys that unlock hidden doors? If the Church provides all necessary mediation between human and divine, what purpose do the old goddesses serve except to lead souls astray? The answer emerges from the theological laboratories where Christian doctrine is refined. Hecate is not a goddess at all, but a demon who appears in divine form to deceive those who seek wisdom outside the boundaries of orthodox revelation. Her keys do not unlock authentic mysteries, but false ones. Her torches do not illumine truth, but create illusions that lead seekers away from salvation. Her crossroads are not places of choice, but traps where the unwary are snared by promises of power that can only be fulfilled through diabolic pacts. The transformation proceeds through careful attention to symbolic detail. Hecate's keys, once signs of her authority over the thresholds between worlds, become evidence of her alliance with Satan, who holds the keys to the abyss. Her torches, once symbols of the light she brings to dark places, become the false illumination that demons use to lure souls into spiritual darkness. Her triple form, once representing her dominion over heaven, earth, and underworld, becomes proof of her mockery of the Christian Trinity. Most significantly, her association with crossroads becomes evidence of her role as the tempter who offers false choices to those who should trust in divine providence rather than human decision. The crossroads where she appears are no longer places of authentic spiritual choice, but diabolic marketplaces where souls are bought and sold for temporal advantages that cost eternal damnation. But the goddess who governs transformation cannot be eliminated merely by being reclassified. She continues to appear wherever human beings face genuine choices, real transitions, authentic encounters with the unknown. The midwife who eases difficult births invokes her protection, even if the name spoken is now Saint Margaret rather than Hecate Curatrophus. The traveller who leaves bread at the place where three roads meet honours her authority, even if the act is explained as feeding the poor, rather than offering sacrifice to the goddess of wayfarers. The witch trials of the early modern period become a systematic archaeological excavation of her surviving influence. The accused confess to meetings at crossroads, to receiving keys and daggers from a figure who appears sometimes as a woman, sometimes as a dog, sometimes as a serpent, all forms that Hecate wore in her ancient worship. They describe learning the properties of herbs, the techniques of divination, the methods of crossing between worlds that were once the curriculum of mystery schools, but now become evidence of demonic instruction. Margaret Murray, burned in Salem in 1692, confesses to meeting the devil at the crossroads where Gallows Hill meets the old Indian Trail. He appeared, she testifies, as a tall woman in black robes, carrying keys that gleamed silver in the moonlight. She taught Margaret which plants could ease childbirth pain, which stones could ward off illness, which words could call spirits to carry messages between the living and the dead. To the judges who condemn her, this is clear evidence of diabolic seduction. To a scholar of ancient religion, it sounds like a perfectly traditional initiation into the mysteries of Hecate Kleidushos, the keyholder, the mediator between worlds. But the most profound transformation occurs in the realm of knowledge itself. In pagan thought, wisdom was gendered feminine. Sophia in the Greek tradition, Saraswati in the Indian, Isis in the Egyptian, Bridget in the Celtic. These goddesses embodied not just the possession of knowledge, but its acquisition, the dangerous and necessary process by which consciousness expands beyond its initial boundaries to encompass new understanding of reality. Christian theology cannot accommodate such feminine wisdom without undermining the masculine authority that governs church hierarchy and scriptural interpretation. Divine revelation flows through patriarchal channels, from God the Father through Christ the Son to apostles and bishops who are exclusively male. Women may receive divine visions, but these must be validated by male authorities who determine their authenticity. They may achieve sanctity, but only through the renunciation of specifically feminine powers, sexuality, autonomy, the authority that comes from direct experience rather than mediated instruction. The Gnostic traditions that flourish in Christianity's early centuries present the most direct challenge to this masculine monopoly on divine wisdom. Their scriptures speak of Sophia as the divine feminine principle, whose fall from grace creates the material world, whose restoration through gnosis enables souls to return to their divine origins. They describe a Jesus who reveals secret teachings to Mary Magdalene, who recognizes women as equals in the quest for spiritual knowledge, who validates feminine spiritual authority through direct transmission rather than institutional appointment. But Gnosticism itself becomes heresy as Christian orthodoxy consolidates its power. The Gospels that present women as teachers and prophets disappear into desert caves where Coptic monks bury them for preservation. The Gospel of Mary that describes Magdalene receiving private instruction from the risen Christ becomes forbidden knowledge. The Thunder, Perfect Mind, where a goddess speaks in paradoxes about being both honored and scorned, virgin and whore, becomes the whispered heresy of underground communities that practice their mysteries in secret. The serpent undergoes its own theological metamorphosis, from symbol of wisdom to emblem of deception. In the ancient Near East, serpents represented renewal and transformation because of their ability to shed their skins and emerge apparently reborn. The snake goddess of Crete held serpents in her upraised hands as symbols of her power over the cycles of death and rebirth. The python of Delphi was not Apollo's enemy but his oracular voice, the chthonic wisdom that spoke from Earth's depths to guide mortal decisions. But in the Genesis narrative that becomes foundational to Christian understanding, the serpent transforms into the seducer whose wisdom is actually deception, whose promise of godlike knowledge leads only to exile from paradise. The creature that once represented the integration of earthly wisdom with divine knowledge becomes the agent of their separation, the tempter who offers false transcendence through disobedience to divine command. Eve herself undergoes the most complete transformation of all. In earlier Near Eastern mythologies, the first woman was often a goddess, Inanna in Sumerian tradition, Isis in Egyptian, the various mother goddesses who created both divine and mortal beings through their own reproductive power. She was not subordinate to masculine authority, but equal or superior to it. Not the cause of cosmic disaster, but the source of cosmic creativity. The biblical account reverses this relationship entirely. Eve is created from Adam's rib rather than giving birth to him from her own substance. She is tempted by the serpent rather than receiving its wisdom as her rightful inheritance. Her acquisition of knowledge becomes the cause of universal suffering rather than the foundation of human consciousness. Her sexuality becomes the contamination that requires redemption rather than the sacred power that generates all existence. This theological revision creates the template for all subsequent demonization of feminine divinity. The goddess who creates becomes the woman who destroys. The divine mother who nurtures all beings becomes the seductress who leads them to ruin. The wise woman who knows the secrets of life and death becomes the witch whose knowledge serves only evil purposes. Lilith emerges from Jewish folklore as the alternative to Eve that orthodoxy cannot tolerate. In rabbinic literature, she is Adam's first wife, created like him from dust rather than from his flesh, who refuses to submit to his authority and flies away to become the mother of demons. Her crime is not disobedience to God, but equality with man, not knowledge of good and evil, but refusal to accept subordination as her natural condition. she becomes the first feminist, the woman who chooses autonomy over security, knowledge over ignorance, power over protection. But in a theological system that requires feminine submission for cosmic order, such choices can only be demonic. Lilith's independence proves her alliance with Satan. Her knowledge demonstrates her corruption. Her power reveals her fundamental opposition to divine design. The artistic tradition preserves these transformations in pigment and stone, creating a visual vocabulary of feminine corruption that will haunt Western consciousness for millennia. Medieval manuscripts depict Eve with serpentine lower body, her human torso emerging from coils that identify her with the tempter whose voice she heeds. Byzantine mosaics show Lilith with owl's feet and wings, the night demon who steals children and seduces sleeping men. Renaissance paintings present witches flying through storm clouds on goats and broomsticks, their naked bodies advertising the sexuality that proves their diabolic allegiance. But the most revealing images are those that show the transformation in progress. In Romanesque sculptures, the Serpent of Eden still bears a woman's face and breasts, representing the moment when feminine wisdom becomes feminine temptation. In Gothic manuscripts, Eve's expression as she reaches for the forbidden fruit shows not simple disobedience, but the hunger for knowledge that goddesses once satisfied without shame or punishment. These transitional images reveal what the completed theology obscures, that the demonization of feminine divinity required the systematic destruction of alternative ways of understanding the relationship between knowledge and virtue, between sexuality and spirituality, between feminine autonomy and cosmic order. The woman who thinks for herself becomes the woman who serves Satan. The woman who seeks knowledge outside approved channels becomes the witch who consorts with demons. The woman who refuses male authority becomes the monster who threatens civilization itself. The medical persecution of midwives and healers represents the practical application of this theological transformation. For centuries, women had served as the primary medical practitioners in their communities. Their knowledge of herbs and anatomy passed down through generations of mothers and daughters. They understood which plants could ease pain, prevent conception, induce abortion, facilitate difficult births. Their success rates often surpassed those of university-trained physicians who relied on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. But such knowledge, in the new theological framework, can only come from diabolic sources. The woman who knows how to end unwanted pregnancies must have learned from demons who delight in the destruction of innocent life. The midwife, whose patients survive difficult births, must have made pacts with Satan, who grants temporary success in exchange for eternal damnation. The herbalist, whose remedies work better than official medicine, must be channeling demonic power rather than natural wisdom. The Malleus Maleficarum, that handbook of feminine persecution, makes the connection explicit. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. Wherefore, for the sake of fulfilling their lusts, they consort with devils. The woman's body itself becomes evidence of her diabolic nature, her capacity for sexual pleasure proof of her alliance with forces that oppose spiritual purity. This creates a theological double bind that makes feminine spiritual authority almost impossible to maintain. The woman who renounces sexuality may achieve sainthood, but only by rejecting the very qualities that goddesses once embodied: fertility, sensuality, the integration of body and spirit. The woman who embraces her feminine nature risks being classified as demonic, her natural capacities reinterpreted as supernatural corruptions. The mystic who receives visions must prove they come from God rather than the devil, but such proof can only be provided by male authorities who may be more comfortable condemning feminine spirituality than validating it. The healer whose methods work too well becomes suspect of diabolic assistance. The prophet whose words prove accurate may be accused of fortune-telling rather than divine revelation. Joan of Arc embodies both the possibility and the danger of feminine spiritual authority in Christian culture. Her voices, which she identifies as Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine, direct her to save France from English occupation and ensure the Dauphin's coronation as rightful king. Her success on the battlefield seems to confirm divine approval of her mission, but her ultimate fate reveals the precariousness of feminine religious authority that cannot be controlled by ecclesiastical institutions. When political necessity no longer requires her services, her voices become demonic delusions. Her cross-dressing becomes evidence of diabolical influence. Her refusal to submit to church authority becomes proof of her alliance with Satan. She burns not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well, demonstrating that women could receive divine communication directly rather than through masculine mediation. But perhaps the most significant survival of the condemned goddesses occurs in the figure of the Virgin Mary, who preserves certain aspects of feminine divinity while carefully avoiding the qualities that made goddesses dangerous to patriarchal authority. Mary maintains the maternal function without the sexual independence, the compassionate intervention without the autonomous power, the wisdom of the heart without the knowledge of the mind. She becomes the acceptable face of the divine feminine, the woman who can be honored without threatening masculine supremacy, who can work miracles without claiming authority, who can intercede for sinners without judging their actions. Her immaculate conception removes her from the contamination of ordinary sexuality, while her perpetual virginity ensures that her power remains spiritual rather than physical. But even Mary's purified femininity requires careful theological management. She may intercede but not command, may request but not demand, may influence but not control. Her apparitions consistently direct visionaries to build churches, establish devotions, and seek clerical approval, rather than encouraging direct spiritual relationships or autonomous religious authority. The goddesses who refused such limitations survived in different forms, becoming the wise women of folk tradition, the fairy godmothers of children's tales, the witches of horror stories who embody both the power and the danger of feminine wisdom that operates outside approved channels. They appear in dreams and visions that cannot be censored, in moments of inspiration that bypass institutional authority, in the quiet miracles of intuitive knowledge that women access through sources deeper than conscious learning. Baba Yaga, the witch of Russian folklore, preserves many characteristics of the ancient crone goddess. She dwells in the liminal space between civilization and wilderness, offers aid to those who approach her with proper respect, and destroys those who attempt to trick or manipulate her. Her chicken-legged hut turns its back on the human world, accessible only to those who know the proper words to make it face them. She is neither good nor evil in the Christian sense, but amoral in the older sense, a force of nature that responds to human behavior according to laws that predate moral theology. The fairy godmother of Cinderella stories embodies the benevolent aspect of the goddess who transforms those who serve faithfully and suffer patiently. Her magic works through natural elements. Pumpkins become coaches, mice become horses, rags become gowns, demonstrating the animistic consciousness that recognizes divine power in everyday objects. But her help comes with time limits and moral conditions that reflect Christian influence on older mythological patterns. Even contemporary horror stories preserve the memory of divine feminine power, though filtered through the fear that such power generates in cultures trained to see feminine autonomy as threatening. The witch who curses those who cross her, the vengeful ghost who refuses to rest until justice is served, the vampire queen who commands legions of the undead, all embody aspects of goddess energy that patriarchal consciousness cannot integrate and therefore must demonize. The psychological legacy of this demonization appears in the collective unconscious as a deep ambivalence toward feminine power that manifests in countless individual neuroses and cultural pathologies. The man who fears commitment may be unconsciously terrified of the devouring mother goddess, whose love can trap souls in material existence. The woman who distrusts her own intuition may have internalized centuries of conditioning that feminine knowledge is either worthless or dangerous. Modern therapeutic approaches that validate feminine ways of knowing, intuition, emotion, bodily wisdom, cyclical rather than linear thinking, represent attempts to heal the split that Christian theology introduced between masculine reason and feminine feeling. They recognize that psychological wholeness requires integration of both modes of consciousness, that wisdom emerges from the marriage of thinking and feeling, rather than the domination of one by the other. The feminist movement of the 20th century explicitly challenges the theological assumptions that justified feminine subordination for millennia. When women reclaim the names that were forbidden, goddess, priestess, witch, they assert not just political equality, but epistemological authority, the right to define reality according to their own experience, rather than accepting masculine interpretations of feminine nature. The return of goddess spirituality in neo-pagan movements represents more than religious revival. It constitutes a fundamental challenge to the dualistic consciousness that sees spirit and matter, mind and body, masculine and feminine as eternal opposites rather than complementary aspects of unified reality. When women light candles on altars decorated with images of Hecate and Isis, Bridget and Kaylee, they reclaim not just religious symbols, but ways of understanding the relationship between human consciousness and divine mystery. But perhaps the most significant return of the serpent's wisdom occurs in the growing recognition that environmental crisis requires feminine principles of nurturing and relationship, rather than masculine principles of domination and control. The earth itself is being rediscovered as a living system, rather than dead matter, as Gaia rather than resource, as mother rather than machine. The woman who tends her garden by lunar phases, who saves seeds from heritage varieties, who teaches her children to see divinity in growing things, participates in the same consciousness that honored Demeter and Ceres, Freya and Bridget. She may not call herself a priestess, may not identify her practices as worship, but her hands remember what her mind has forgotten, that the feminine principle of nurturing relationship with the natural world offers an alternative to the masculine principle of technological domination. The serpent's wisdom speaks again in the understanding that knowledge and sexuality, body and spirit, earth and heaven, are not enemies, but allies in the dance of existence. The feminine divine returns not as a competitor to masculine spirituality, but as its necessary partner, not as a threat to social order, but as the foundation of any order worth preserving. She rises from her long exile bearing the keys that unlock the doors between worlds, carrying the torches that illumine the paths between knowing and being, speaking the words that transform curse into blessing, poison into medicine, fear into love. She is not the enemy of consciousness, but its forgotten half, not the opponent of wisdom, but its deepest source, not the tempter who leads souls astray, but the guide who shows them the way home to the integrated awareness that honors both the heights of spirit and the depths of matter. The serpent sheds its skin and emerges renewed. The woman speaks her truth and transforms the world. The goddess returns not to destroy what was built without her, but to complete what could never be finished in her absence. The sacred marriage between all the pairs of opposites that must dance together if existence is to fulfill its promise of beauty, meaning and love that encompasses both ecstasy and suffering in the eternal celebration of being alive. The house spirit watches as strangers nail iron crosses to the doorframes that once welcomed his blessings. In the wooden farmhouse outside Novgorod, where generations of the Volkov family have left bread and salt by the hearth each night, the domovoi feels the change like winter settling into his ancient bones. For 3 centuries, he has tended this threshold, swept the floors while the family slept, warned of fires and floods and thieves, blessed the marriages and mourned the deaths of those who honored him with simple offerings and respectful silence. But the new priest speaks words that make the very air turn cold. Every spirit that does not confess Christ has come in the flesh is of the Antichrist. The bread offerings stop. The salt goes into the soup instead of onto the threshold stone. The children who once whispered thank yous to the empty air now cross themselves when shadows move in corners, when floorboards creak without footsteps, when the house itself seems to breathe with presence older than their prayers. This is how guardians become ghosts, how protectors transform into predators, how the spirits who once served as bridges between human need and divine mercy learn to speak in the only language that remains available to them, the vocabulary of fear that labels their love as haunting, their warnings as threats, their continued presence as proof of demonic persistence in a world that has declared their very existence an offense against divine truth. The domovoi is not alone in his exile from grace. Across the Slavic territories where Orthodox Christianity spreads like morning frost, the household gods who have watched over human families since memory began find themselves reclassified as demons whose every blessing becomes a curse, whose every protection becomes an attack, whose every gesture of care becomes evidence of their malevolent nature. The Vila who dances in mountain meadows, her ethereal beauty calling travelers to witness the sacred marriage between earth and sky, becomes a predatory seductress who lures men to their deaths in avalanches and crevasses. The protective warnings she once whispered to those who approach dangerous paths become the siren songs that draw the unwary to destruction. Her dance, once a celebration of the divine feminine principle that moves through all natural phenomena, becomes the hypnotic motion that traps souls in fatal enchantment. The Rusalka, who dwells in river pools, guardian of the waters that give life to crops and flocks, transforms into a vengeful spirit who drowns the innocent. Her songs, once blessings that called rain from dry skies, become laments that pull swimmers beneath the surface. Her knowledge of water's moods and seasons becomes diabolic power used to flood fields and wreck boats. The flowers she wore as crown of her river sovereignty become the pale blooms that mark where her victims lie beneath the current. But perhaps the most tragic transformation occurs to the Leshy, the forest lord whose duty was to maintain the balance between human need and woodland health. For millennia, he had served as the mediator who ensured that hunters took only what was necessary, that woodcutters left enough trees for regeneration, that the ancient contract between civilization and wilderness remained intact through mutual respect and reciprocal offerings. The Christian missionaries who penetrate his domain see only a demon who leads travelers astray, who causes them to lose their way in forests they have known since childhood, who whispers blasphemous thoughts into minds that should be filled only with orthodox prayer. They do not understand that his apparent malice is actually protective action, that he confuses those who enter his woods with axes sharp enough to clear-cut sacred groves, that he misdirects those who come with traps cruel enough to eliminate entire species, that he frightens away those whose presence would disturb the delicate relationships that keep forest ecosystems healthy and whole. The missionaries' journals describe encounters with a creature of shifting size who appears sometimes as a giant whose head brushes the treetops, sometimes as a dwarf who can hide beneath mushrooms. His body seems made of bark and moss. His hair flows like wind-blown leaves. His eyes burn with green fire that reveals his diabolic nature. But what they interpret as shape-shifting deception is actually the Leshy's natural ability to embody whatever aspect of forest consciousness the situation requires, vast enough to represent old-growth majesty, small enough to tend individual seedlings, fluid enough to adapt to the changing needs of his woodland realm. The transformation of guardian spirits into malevolent entities follows a predictable theological pattern that reveals more about Christian anxieties than about the actual nature of the beings being demonized. Every protective function becomes reinterpreted as predatory behavior. Every warning becomes a threat. Every test of character becomes a trap designed to damn souls rather than strengthen them. The fairy courts of Celtic tradition undergo particularly complex metamorphosis because their moral system operates according to principles that Christian theology cannot easily categorize. The Seelie court, traditionally benevolent toward humans who treat them with respect, becomes a demonic army led by fallen angels who can appear beautiful to deceive the unwary. The Unseelie court, always dangerous but not necessarily evil, becomes a straightforward congregation of devils whose only purpose is to lead mortals to spiritual destruction. But the individual transformations reveal the deeper pattern. The Bean Seeder, whose keen warned families of approaching death so they could prepare spiritually for the transition, becomes the Banshee, whose wail causes death rather than predicting it. Her mourning for those who die far from home becomes diabolic celebration of souls departing without final sacraments. Her genealogical knowledge, which helped families understand their spiritual obligations to ancestors, becomes diabolic intelligence about bloodlines that can be corrupted through generational curses. The Ich-Wisha, the water horse whose appearance warned of dangerous currents and seasonal floods, becomes a predatory shapeshifter who deliberately drowns his riders. His shining coat that reflected sunlight on safe waters becomes the glamour that conceals his demonic nature. His knowledge of river conditions becomes supernatural cunning used to trap victims. The respect he demanded from those who used his waters becomes the worship that demons require from their human servants. Most significantly, the tests that guardian spirits traditionally imposed on mortals, tests of courage, generosity, wisdom, and respect, become diabolic temptations designed to lead souls away from salvation. The fairy godmother, who appears as an ugly old woman begging for food, testing whether the protagonist will show kindness to the apparently worthless, becomes a demon who rewards material generosity in order to corrupt spiritual priorities. The giant who challenges heroes to contests of strength or wit becomes Satan, testing Christ in the wilderness, offering earthly power in exchange for divine allegiance. This reinterpretation transforms the entire moral landscape of folklore. Stories that once taught complex lessons about the necessity of respecting non-human intelligence, about the importance of maintaining reciprocal relationships with spiritual forces, about the value of courage and compassion in dealing with the unknown, become simple tales of temptation resisted or punishment deserved. The psychological sophistication that allowed ancient peoples to navigate relationships with spiritual beings of ambiguous morality gives way to binary thinking that recognizes only saints and demons, only absolute good and absolute evil. The colonization of the Americas provides the most systematic example of how guardian spirits are transformed into demons through the theological machinery of Christian conquest. When Spanish missionaries encounter indigenous peoples, whose spiritual relationships with land and weather, animals and ancestors operate through ceremonial reciprocity rather than worship of a single supreme deity, they immediately classify these spirits as diabolic entities that must be driven out through exorcism and replaced with proper Christian devotion. The Aztec Tlaloque, rain spirits who dwelt in mountain peaks and brought the precipitation that ensured agricultural survival, become demons who demand human sacrifice in exchange for natural benefits that God provides freely to those who trust in divine providence. Their temples become devil's altars. Their priests become Satan's servants. Their ceremonies become blasphemous parodies of Christian ritual. But the Spanish chroniclers, who document these demonic practices, rarely understand their actual function within indigenous cosmology. The offerings made to rain spirits are not payment to capricious deities, but participation in the reciprocal relationships that maintain ecological balance. The ceremonies that appear to European eyes as devil worship are actually sophisticated technologies for maintaining the psychological and spiritual states that allow human communities to thrive within natural systems rather than in opposition to them. The same pattern repeats across the colonized Americas. The Hopi Cachinas, spirit beings who embody the forces that bring rain and fertility to desert pueblos, become demons who mislead indigenous peoples with false promises of agricultural success that can only come through Christian prayer. Their masks and dances become diabolic pageantry. Their seasonal appearances become demonic manifestations. Their teaching stories become blasphemous myths that must be suppressed in favor of biblical truth. The Wendigo of Algonquian tradition, the cannibal giant whose appearance warns of the spiritual dangers of consuming others rather than sharing with them, becomes simply a monster that devours human flesh without the moral instruction that was always central to its meaning. The psychological sophistication that used supernatural horror to teach social ethics. That starvation can drive people to behaviors that destroy community bonds. That survival requires collective cooperation rather than individual predation. Disappears beneath Christian interpretations that see only literal monsters requiring literal destruction. The African spirits that survive the Middle Passage undergo their own transformation as they encounter Christian theology in slave societies that use religious conversion as a tool of cultural control. The Yoruba Orisha, who serve as intermediaries between human communities and the divine source of all existence, become demons who must be cast out through Christian baptism. Their specific areas of governance, Yemoja's dominion over waters, Oshun's rule over rivers and fertility, Ogun's mastery of iron and warfare, become diabolic specializations that demons use to maintain influence over souls that properly belong to Christ. But the theological transformation cannot entirely suppress the practical reality that these spirits continue to provide what they have always provided: healing for the sick, protection from enemies, guidance through difficult decisions, connection to ancestral wisdom that helps communities survive in hostile environments. The result is the development of elaborate syncretistic systems where African spirits hide behind Christian saints, accepting Catholic names while maintaining their traditional functions. Yemoja becomes Our Lady of Regla, her blue and white robes echoing the colors of ocean waves, her maternal protection extending to all who call upon her, whether they use African or Christian terminology. Oshun becomes Our Lady of Charity, her association with rivers and fertility preserved through devotion to a saint, whose miracles often involve water and whose protection extends to women in childbirth. Ogun becomes Saint Peter, his keys to the kingdom of heaven, interpreted as mastery over the iron tools that both create and destroy. These transformations allow the spirits to survive while appearing to submit to Christian authority. They accept new names and new theological explanations for their powers, while continuing to serve their traditional functions within communities that understand the difference between official doctrine and practical spirituality. The Orisha, who appears as a Catholic saint to satisfy missionary demands, reveals himself in dreams and possessions as the familiar spirit whose personality and preferences remain unchanged despite his Christian disguise. The persistence of guardian spirits in folk tradition creates ongoing theological problems for Christian authorities who cannot deny their effectiveness while maintaining their demonic nature. The house spirit, who protects families from fire and theft, cannot be eliminated simply by being reclassified as a demon. His protective functions continue regardless of theological interpretation, creating cognitive dissonance that must be resolved through increasingly complex explanations. The solution that emerges creates a new category of supernatural being: the demon who serves God's purposes without knowing it. The fallen spirit whose malevolent intentions are frustrated by divine providence and turn to beneficial ends. This allows Christian theologians to acknowledge the practical benefits that people receive from relationships with spirits, while maintaining that such relationships are spiritually dangerous because they involve trafficking with diabolic entities. The angel of the house who sweeps floors and tends fires becomes a demon whose obsessive-compulsive behavior accidentally produces beneficial results. The The woodland spirit, who warns of dangerous storms, becomes a devil whose territorial aggression coincidentally protects travelers from harm. The water sprite, who guides boats to safety, becomes a demonic deceiver whose plans to shipwreck vessels are consistently thwarted by divine intervention. But such explanations require increasingly elaborate mental gymnastics that eventually collapse under the weight of their own complexity. If demons consistently produce beneficial results through their malevolent actions, in what sense can they be considered malevolent? If God regularly uses diabolic agents to accomplish divine purposes, what practical difference exists between angels and demons? If guardian spirits continue to guard regardless of their theological classification, why should theology matter more than results? The folk traditions that preserve guardian spirit relationships operate according to practical rather than theological logic. The farmer who leaves beer for the house spirit cares less about the entity's ontological status than about his family's safety and prosperity. The sailor who pours wine into the ocean to honor sea spirits focuses on safe passage rather than the theological implications of his offerings. The mother who teaches her children to thank the helpful spirits that tend their household maintains relationships that work regardless of whether priests approve. This practical approach to spiritual relationships creates a parallel religious system that operates alongside official Christianity without directly challenging its authority. The same family that attends Sunday Mass and receives the sacraments also maintains household shrines where bread and salt are left for domestic spirits, where flowers are offered to garden deities, where candles are lit for ancestors whose continued presence provides protection and guidance that complements rather than competes with Christian salvation. The survival strategies developed by guardian spirits reveal their essential nature as mediators between human consciousness and the larger spiritual ecosystem that governs both natural and supernatural phenomena. They adapt to new theological environments by accepting new names and new interpretations of their functions, while maintaining their core identity as helpers rather than hinderers, protectors rather than predators, allies rather than enemies. The domovoi who learns to hide when priests visit the household emerges after they leave to resume his traditional duties with the same dedication he has always shown. The leshy who flees deeper into the forest when churches are built in woodland clearings continues to maintain the ecological balance that sustains both human and non-human communities. The rusalka who accepts baptism as a way of legitimizing her river guardianship continues to warn swimmers of dangerous currents while allowing theologians to interpret her actions as evidence of divine grace working through even the most unlikely instruments. But perhaps the most significant survival occurs in the realm of dreams and visions that cannot be censored by ecclesiastical authority. The guardian spirits who are driven from public acknowledgement find refuge in the unconscious mind, where they continue to appear as helpful figures, protective presences, wise counselors who offer guidance that official religion cannot provide. Carl Jung's encounter with his own house spirit, the wise old man he called Philemon, who appeared in active imagination sessions and taught him about the autonomous nature of psychic contents, demonstrates how guardian spirits continue to function within the individual psyche, even when collective culture has declared them non-existent. Jung's careful documentation of his relationship with Philemon reveals that such entities possess intelligence and intentions that operate independently of conscious control, that they provide knowledge and perspective that ego consciousness cannot generate on its own, that they serve protective and educational functions that remain essential for psychological wholeness. Modern therapeutic approaches that work with inner guides, spirit allies, and protective figures represent the return of guardian spirit relationships under psychological rather than religious terminology. They recognize that human consciousness requires relationship with non-ego sources of wisdom and protection, that the individual psyche exists within a larger spiritual ecosystem populated by helpful entities whose assistance remains available to those who know how to ask for it respectfully. the environmental movement that seeks to re-establish reciprocal relationships with the natural world, draws much of its inspiration from the recognition that guardian spirits were right, that human well-being depends on maintaining respectful relationships with the non-human intelligences that govern ecological systems. When activists speak of the rights of nature, when they personify forests and rivers and mountains as entities deserving of legal protection, when they advocate for decision-making processes that consider the interests of future generations and non-human species, they resurrect the consciousness that honored guardian spirits as legitimate participants in the moral community that governs how resources should be used and landscapes should be treated. The house spirit watches as strangers nail iron crosses to the doorframes that once welcomed his blessings. But iron, he knows, is not proof against the love that binds him to the family he has served for centuries. The crosses may declare his exile from grace, but the children still smile when floors are swept by invisible hands, still whisper thank you to the empty air when lost toys appear in obvious places, still feel safer knowing that someone watches over their sleep, even if that someone cannot be named. He adapts to the new theological environment by becoming more subtle, more indirect, less obviously present, but he does not abandon his post, does not withdraw his protection, does not cease his vigilance over those who share his threshold. He simply learns to work through channels that priests cannot monitor, to provide benefits that can be explained by coincidence, to manifest love that wears the disguise of luck. The guardian spirits survive because guardianship itself survives as a necessary function within the spiritual ecology that governs relationships between human consciousness and the larger forces that shape individual and collective destiny. They transform from gods into ghosts, from divine powers into psychological complexes, from religious entities into folklore figures, but they continue to serve the same essential purpose, bridging the gap between human need and spiritual response, between individual vulnerability and cosmic protection, between the loneliness of separate existence and the comfort of knowing that we are never truly alone. They protect because protection is their nature, guard because guardianship is their function, love because love is the force that connects all beings in the web of relationships that makes existence meaningful. They change their forms, but not their essence. Accept new names, but not new purposes. Adapt to new circumstances, but not abandon old loyalties. The cross may proclaim their exile from official grace, but grace itself cannot be confined within official channels. It flows where it will, works through whom it chooses, manifests as it must to accomplish the healing that every age requires. The guardian spirits know this, as they have always known it, that love finds a way, that protection persists, that the helpful powers will never entirely abandon those who need them, no matter what names theology gives to the forces that make existence bearable, meaningful, and occasionally touched with the magic that reminds mortals they are not alone in the vast mystery of being alive. The dead will not stay dead, and the living fear what that means. In the village cemetery of Kisilievo, where Orthodox crosses lean like broken bones against the winter sky, the grave of Peter Blagojevich gapes open for the second time in 3 months. The earth around the hole lies scattered, dark, with something that might be soil, or might be something else entirely. The villagers gather with torches and sharp-pointed stakes, their faces etched with the particular terror that comes when the familiar becomes monstrous, when the beloved become predators, when death itself proves unreliable. But they do not understand what they are about to destroy. The thing that rises from Peter's grave carries within its transformed flesh the memory of older mysteries, deeper truths, sacred relationships between the living and the dead that Christian theology has forgotten how to recognize. They see only a demon that must be eliminated, a corruption that threatens their salvation. They cannot see the dying God who rises to ensure the continuity of life, the ancestor who returns to bless his descendants, the bridge between worlds that allows communication between the quick and the dead. The vampire they fear is the ghost of a god, the remnant of divine mysteries that once taught mortals that death is not termination, but transformation, not ending, but threshold, not defeat, but doorway to powers that transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. Peter Blagojevich rises because something in the collective unconscious of his community still calls to the old knowledge, still remembers when the returning dead brought blessings rather than curses, when the boundary between life and death was permeable rather than absolute, when ancestors remained active participants in the affairs of their descendants. The historical vampire cases that terrorize 18th century Europe reveal the return of suppressed religious traditions disguised as supernatural horror. Arnold Paula in Serbia, Johannes Kuntius in Silesia, the unnamed bloodsuckers of Hungary and Wallachia. All emerge from communities where Eastern Orthodox Christianity has overlaid, but not entirely eliminated, older beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead. In these traditions, the deceased do not immediately depart for heaven or hell, but linger for varying periods in liminal states where they can affect the welfare of their surviving families. The souls that have not yet completed their earthly business may return to protect their property, resolve unfinished conflicts, ensure that proper rituals are performed for their spiritual advancement. Death becomes not a single event, but a process that may require months or years to complete, during which the dead remain partially present in the world they have apparently left. But Christian theology cannot accommodate such complexity without undermining its fundamental claims about the nature of posthumous existence. If souls proceed immediately to judgment and then to their eternal destinations, what are these returning entities that appear to friends and family? If death represents the final separation between temporal and eternal realms, how can the deceased continue to influence earthly affairs? If salvation comes through faith alone, rather than posthumous intervention, why do some souls seem to require ongoing assistance from the living? The answer that emerges from theological investigation transforms beneficial ancestors into malevolent demons. The dead who return to help their families become vampires who prey upon them. The souls who seek proper burial rites become revenants who terrorize the living until their bodies are destroyed. The protective spirits who guard family property become haunting presences, whose very existence proves their diabolic nature. The Strigoi of Romanian tradition embody this transformation most completely. In pre-Christian belief, they were souls of the dead who maintained interest in earthly affairs, sometimes helpful and sometimes harmful, but always recognizably connected to specific individuals whose personalities persisted beyond bodily death. They could appear in dreams to offer advice, manifest physically to warn of dangers, or take possession of living people to communicate urgent messages. But under Christian influence, the Strigoi become uniformly malevolent entities, whose return from death proves their alliance with Satan. Their ability to appear in various forms, as humans, animals, or mist, becomes evidence of diabolic shapeshifting rather than the natural flexibility of spirit beings. Their knowledge of hidden things becomes demonic intelligence rather than the expanded awareness that death traditionally conferred. Their influence over the living becomes possession rather than visitation, corruption rather than communication. The vampire that emerges from this theological transformation carries within its monstrous form the distorted memory of dying and rising gods whose seasonal deaths and resurrections ensured the renewal of life. Dionysus, torn apart by Maenads and reborn from Zeus's thigh, becomes the undead predator who sustains himself by consuming the life force of others. Osiris, murdered by Set and resurrected through Isis's magic, becomes the corpse that refuses to remain in its tomb. Tammuz, who dies each winter and returns each spring, becomes the creature that lives eternally but cannot truly live. The vampire's legendary aversion to Christian symbols reveals the deeper conflict between old religious traditions and new theological orthodoxies. The cross that repels the undead represents not just Christian power, but the specific claim that salvation comes through Christ's unique death and resurrection, rather than through participation in the eternal cycle of death and renewal that governs all existence. The vampire cannot bear the sight of the crucifix because it embodies the assertion that only one dying God is legitimate, that all other death and resurrection mysteries are diabolic counterfeits. Similarly, the vampire's inability to enter running water reflects ancient beliefs about the purifying power of streams and rivers that flow from sacred sources. In pagan thought, moving water carried the blessing of the gods who dwelt in springs and mountains, whose presence could cleanse both physical and spiritual contamination. The vampire's weakness reveals its nature as a spiritually contaminated being that cannot approach the purity that flows from divine sources, not because it is inherently evil, but because it exists in a state of theological limbo between legitimate death and illegitimate resurrection. The werewolf undergoes a parallel transformation from sacred shapeshifter to demonic monster. In Germanic and Celtic traditions, warriors who could take wolf form were honored as beings who had achieved spiritual communion with the wild powers that governed battle and hunt. The berserkers who fought in bear shapes, the Ulfhednar who ran with wolf packs, the Celtic warriors who wore animal skins to channel the strength of their totemic spirits, all represented the integration of human consciousness with animal power that marked the highest achievements of shamanic spirituality. But Christianity cannot accommodate such integration without undermining its fundamental distinction between rational souls created in God's image and irrational beasts that lack spiritual significance. The warrior who becomes a wolf demonstrates dangerous confusion between human and animal nature, between the civilized consciousness that should seek heaven and the wild consciousness that belongs to the earth. The shapeshifter who moves freely between forms suggests that identity itself is fluid, that the boundaries between self and other, human and animal, sacred and profane, are not as absolute as Christian theology requires. The werewolf that emerges from this theological conflict embodies all the fears that arise when the carefully maintained distinction between civilization and wilderness breaks down. The man who becomes wolf represents the return of the repressed wild self that Christian culture has spent centuries trying to suppress. His transformation occurs beyond conscious control, usually during the full moon that governs the cycles of madness and inspiration that rational theology cannot accommodate. His appetite for human flesh represents the cannibalistic hunger that lurks beneath all civilized behavior, the recognition that survival often requires consuming others rather than sharing with them. The Baltic werewolf traditions preserve the most complete memories of the original sacred shapeshifters. In Lithuanian folklore, the Vilkolakis are not monsters, but spiritual warriors who take wolf form to battle against evil forces that threaten their communities. They serve a protective function that parallels the guardian spirits discussed in earlier chapters. They are defenders rather than predators, allies rather than enemies, sacred beings rather than demonic entities. But as Christian influence spreads through the Baltic region, even these protective shapeshifters undergo demonization. Their ability to take animal form becomes evidence of diabolic pacts rather than spiritual achievement. Their nocturnal activities become proof of their alliance with darkness rather than necessary service to the light. Their knowledge of herbal remedies and healing techniques becomes witchcraft rather than shamanic wisdom. The jinn of pre-Islamic Arabia represent perhaps the most complex example of how supernatural beings are transformed through theological conquest. In ancient Arabian tradition, the jinn were a vast and diverse category of spiritual entities that included everything from minor household spirits to powerful desert kings who ruled over cities of fire and air. They possessed intelligence equal or superior to humans, could take various physical forms and maintain complex societies that paralleled but did not duplicate human civilization. Most importantly, the jinn were not inherently good or evil, but morally neutral beings who could be helpful or harmful depending on how they were approached. Some served as allies and teachers to human shamans and poets, providing inspiration and knowledge that came from their access to realms beyond ordinary perception. Others were dangerous and unpredictable, requiring careful negotiation to avoid their wrath. Still others were indifferent to human affairs, pursuing their own mysterious purposes in dimensions that intersected with but did not depend upon the mortal world. The Quranic acknowledgement of jinn as legitimate spiritual beings created theological problems for later Islamic orthodoxy that paralleled those faced by Christian authorities dealing with pagan spirits. If jinn possess free will and can choose between good and evil, why do they not figure more prominently in Islamic salvation history? If they are capable of belief and unbelief, why do they require different prophetic revelation than humans? If they can appear as beautiful beings or terrible monsters, how can mortals distinguish between legitimate spiritual guidance and demonic deception? The solution that emerges transforms the jinn from a diverse community of spiritual beings into a category of creatures whose very existence proves their opposition to Islamic orthodoxy. The jinn who appear as teachers become demons who mislead students with false knowledge. The jinn who provide inspiration to poets become devils who corrupt literature with blasphemous content. The jinn who offer wishes to mortals become tempters who grant material benefits in exchange for spiritual corruption. This theological transformation appears most clearly in the Arabian Nights, where jinn are consistently portrayed as powerful but morally suspect beings whose gifts come with dangerous strings attached. The genie who grants wishes inevitably interprets them in ways that punish rather than reward the wisher. The jinn who appears as a beautiful woman seduces men to their destruction. The Ifrit, who serves as a magical ally, eventually betrays his human partner when better opportunities arise. But these literary depictions preserve the memory of the original jinn traditions even as they demonize them. The jinn's vast powers, their knowledge of hidden things, their ability to travel between dimensions, their complex societies and moral systems, all of these characteristics reflect authentic traditions about spiritual beings who were understood to be neither angels nor demons, but something else entirely, inhabitants of a middle realm between divine and mortal existence. The Wendigo of Algonquian tradition represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated example of how spiritual horror serves educational purposes that are lost when the entities are reclassified as simple monsters. In indigenous North American cultures, the Wendigo is not just a cannibalistic giant, but a spiritual disease that affects individuals who violate the fundamental social taboo against consuming community members rather than sharing resources with them. The Wendigo transformation occurs when starvation or other extreme circumstances drive people to cannibalism. But the physical consumption of human flesh is only the beginning of a spiritual metamorphosis that gradually strips away everything that makes life worth living. The Wendigo becomes physically larger but spiritually emptier, gains supernatural strength but loses all capacity for satisfaction, develops an endless hunger that can never be filled, no matter how much it devours. This represents sophisticated psychological insight into the nature of addictive behavior and social predation disguised as supernatural horror. The person who begins consuming others, whether literally through cannibalism or metaphorically through exploitation, manipulation, and abuse, enters a spiritual state where satisfaction becomes impossible because the act of predation itself destroys the capacity for contentment. The Wendigo grows larger with each victim but becomes more desperately hungry, demonstrating that predatory behavior is ultimately self-defeating because it eliminates the very relationships that make existence meaningful. But when European colonizers encounter Wendigo traditions, they see only primitive superstition about literal monsters that must be eliminated through through Christian education and medical intervention. They cannot recognize the sophisticated social psychology embedded in the supernatural narrative, the way that horror stories serve as community protection against behavioral patterns that threaten group survival. The Banshee of Irish tradition undergoes similar simplification as she is transformed from ancestral messenger to harbinger of doom. In Celtic belief, the Bean Sidhe was a fairy woman attached to specific family lines who appeared to keen for clan members who died far from home, ensuring that their souls received proper mourning, even when their bodies could not be retrieved for traditional burial. Her wailing served as spiritual first aid, providing the ritual lament that helped souls transition from earthly to otherworldly existence. The Banshee's genealogical knowledge allowed her to appear only for deaths within families that had maintained proper relationships with the fairy realm through generations of respectful offerings and ritual observances. Her keening was not a cause of death, but a response to it, not a curse, but a blessing that ensured the deceased would not be forgotten, would not pass into the next world without proper acknowledgement of their lives and losses. But as Christian influence spreads through Ireland, the Banshee becomes a sinister figure whose appearance causes death rather than responding to it. Her keen becomes a death-dealing wail rather than a healing lament. Her family connections become evidence of hereditary curses rather than ancestral protection. Her knowledge of approaching deaths becomes diabolic foresight rather than fairy wisdom. The psychological function of these transformed monsters reveals their essential nature as repositories of spiritual knowledge that official religion cannot accommodate, but human consciousness cannot entirely abandon. The vampire preserves the understanding that death is not absolute termination, that the dead maintain interest in the affairs of the living, that the boundary between life and death is more permeable than rational theology admits. The werewolf embodies the recognition that human beings are animals as well as spirits, that civilization requires integration with, rather than domination of wild nature, that identity itself is more fluid and complex than official doctrine acknowledges. The jinn represent the persistent awareness that spiritual reality contains levels of existence that cannot be reduced to simple categories of divine and demonic, that intelligence and will operate in forms that do not necessarily conform to human or angelic models, that the universe contains mysteries that no single religious tradition can fully encompass or explain. Even in their demonized forms, these beings continue to serve essential psychological functions. The vampire movies that proliferate in modern popular culture allow audiences to explore themes of eternal life, sexual liberation, aristocratic power, and the relationship between predation and intimacy that rational discourse cannot address directly. The werewolf stories provide safe spaces for examining the tension between civilized behavior and animal instincts, between conscious control and unconscious drives, between individual identity and group loyalty. The jinn who appear in contemporary fantasy literature offer readers the opportunity to consider what they would do with unlimited power, how they would handle the responsibility that comes with the ability to reshape reality according to personal desire, what they would choose if every choice carried unforeseeable consequences that might transform blessing into curse. But perhaps most importantly, these monsters preserve in popular culture the memory of spiritual traditions that recognize the divine in forms that official religion declared demonic. They serve as bridges between the conscious mind that accepts orthodox theology and the unconscious psyche that remembers older, more complex relationships with supernatural forces. Carl Jung's analysis of the vampire archetype reveals its function as a symbol of the unlived life that haunts those who have sacrificed their authentic desires to social expectations and religious demands. The vampire's eternal existence represents the part of the psyche that refuses to die even when cut off from legitimate expression, that continues to seek nourishment even when denied access to healthy relationships, that becomes predatory when forced to operate through shadow channels rather than conscious integration. The werewolf embodies what Jung called the shadow, the repressed aspects of personality that return with destructive force when they cannot be acknowledged and integrated through conscious choice. The transformation that occurs beyond conscious control represents what happens when natural instincts are suppressed so thoroughly that they can only emerge through pathological channels. The jinn, in their original multiplicity and moral ambiguity, represent what Jung identified as autonomous complexes, psychological entities that possess their own intelligence and agenda, that cannot be controlled through conscious will alone, that require respectful negotiation rather than authoritarian command. Modern therapeutic approaches that work with these archetypal energies recognize that psychological health requires relationship with the inner vampire that refuses to let unlived possibilities die, with the inner werewolf that connects individual consciousness to collective and instinctual wisdom, with the inner jinn that possess knowledge and power beyond the reach of rational ego consciousness. The monsters that terrify us in stories and dreams are often the gods we have forgotten how to honor, the spiritual forces we have learned to fear rather than integrate, the aspects of our own nature that we have declared demonic rather than divine. They rise from graves we thought were sealed, transform under moons we thought were merely astronomical objects, grant wishes we thought were impossible, keen for losses we thought were safely buried. They will not stay dead because they were never meant to die. They were meant to be honored, consulted, integrated into the conscious life of individuals and communities that understood the necessity of maintaining relationships with all the forces that govern human existence, not just the ones that official theology declares acceptable. Peter Blagojevich rises from his grave not because he has become a demon, but because something in his community still calls to the old knowledge, still remembers when death was passage rather than termination, still needs the returning ancestor who bridges the worlds that official religion has declared forever separate. The villagers who drive stakes through his heart destroy not just a monster, but a memory, not just a threat, but a bridge, not just a demon, but the ghost of a god who might have taught them that the dead do not abandon the living, that love persists beyond the grave, that the barriers between worlds are not as absolute as their priests have taught them to believe. But gods, like love, like truth itself, cannot be killed with wooden stakes or silver bullets or ritual exorcisms. They can only be driven deeper underground, where they wait with the patience of beings who measure time in centuries rather than years, where they grow stronger in the darkness of repression, where they prepare for their inevitable return to consciousness that will always rediscover what theology tried to destroy, that the universe is larger and stranger and more alive than any single tradition can contain, that the monsters we fear often carry the keys to the wholeness we seek, that what we call evil is often just the divine wearing a face we have been taught not to recognize. The story changes in the telling, but the truth survives the lie. In the cottage kitchen, where turf burns blue bright against October darkness, the old woman spins wool and spins words with equal skill, her voice weaving patterns that her great-grandmother knew, that stretch back through generations of women who understood that some knowledge is too precious to write down, too dangerous to speak plainly, too essential to let die even when empires rise and fall, and rise again around the unbroken circle of human need. Once upon a time, she begins, but already the phrase carries sedition in its syllables. Once upon a time means before the priests came, before the crosses replaced the sacred groves, before the old ways were declared evil and the new ways proclaimed the only path to salvation. Once upon a time opens a door to the world that was, when gods walked among mortals, and mortals knew their place in the great web of relationships that connected all things in bonds stronger than iron, deeper than faith, older than the words that try to capture them. The children gathered around her spinning wheel do not know they are learning heresy. They think they are hearing fairy tales, simple entertainment for long winter nights, when the wind carries voices that might be spirits calling from the bog, when shadows move without bodies to cast them, when the boundary between story and reality grows thin as mist over water. But the old woman knows what she is really doing, preserving the underground river of memory that flows beneath the surface of Christian civilization, keeping alive the wisdom that official religion tried to dam but could never entirely stop. This is how gods survived their own extinction. Not through grand gestures of defiance, but through quiet acts of cultural preservation. Not by demanding worship, but by accepting disguise. Not by conquering new territories, but by inhabiting the spaces that orthodoxy overlooks or considers harmless. The fairy tale becomes the sanctuary where banned deities find refuge, where suppressed wisdom hides in plain sight, where children learn to recognize the sacred in forms that priests would never suspect. Baba Yaga stands in her chicken-legged hut at the boundary between the known and unknown worlds, her iron teeth gleaming in firelight that casts shadows older than the churches built over pagan altars. She is neither good nor evil in the Christian sense, but amoral in the older sense, a force of nature that responds to human behavior according to laws that predate moral theology. The children who approach her with respect and proper offerings receive aid that can transform their lives. Those who come with arrogance or deception discover that ancient powers have little patience for the presumptions of the newly righteous. But Baba Yaga is not just a character in Russian folktales. She is the survival form of the crone goddess who appears in cultures across the world. The wise woman whose apparent hideousness conceals divine wisdom, whose tests separate the worthy from the unworthy, whose gifts come at prices that teach the true value of what is freely given. She is Hecate in her crone aspect, the third face of the triple goddess who rules the crossroads where life meets death, wisdom meets ignorance, courage meets cowardice. The hut that stands on chicken legs preserves the memory of ancient temples that were built on posts to elevate them above the sacred ground, that could be turned to face different directions according to seasonal requirements that served as doorways between the human world and the realm of spirits. The iron teeth that gleam in Baba Yaga's mouth remember the metal tools that were considered magical in cultures just learning to work iron, that marked the transition from Stone Age innocence to Metal Age wisdom, that cut through illusions as efficiently as they cut through flesh and bone. Most importantly, the tests that Baba Yaga imposes on her visitors preserve the understanding that wisdom cannot be purchased or inherited, but must be earned through confronting the aspects of existence that civilized society prefers to ignore. She demands that heroes face their fears, acknowledge their mortality, recognize their dependence on forces beyond their control. Those who pass her tests receive not just magical assistance, but psychological transformation that enables them to succeed where conventional wisdom fails. The fairy godmother of Western European tales embodies the benevolent aspect of the same archetypal energy, the helpful goddess who appears in moments of greatest need to provide the resources that make transformation possible. But her gifts always come with conditions that reflect pre-Christian understanding of how supernatural aid actually works. The help lasts only until midnight. The magic fails if its recipient forgets her true nature. The blessings disappear if they are used for selfish purposes rather than genuine necessity. Cinderella's pumpkin coach preserves the memory of seasonal festivals where ordinary objects were transformed through ritual recognition of the divine presence that inhabits all things. The pumpkin that becomes a vehicle represents the same consciousness that saw gods in trees and streams, spirits in stones and springs, sacred power flowing through forms that appear mundane to eyes that have forgotten how to see the miraculous in the everyday. The glass slipper that fits only the true bride remembers older marriage customs where divine approval was required for unions that would affect the welfare of entire communities. The prince who searches for his destined partner demonstrates the ancient understanding that some relationships are written in the stars. that compatibility operates according to spiritual laws that cannot be reduced to social conventions or personal preferences. But perhaps most significantly, the fairy godmother's insistence that Cinderella return before midnight preserves the wisdom that magical aid is temporary, that transformation requires not just external assistance but internal work, that sustainable change comes through integration of supernatural gifts with natural efforts rather than dependence on miraculous intervention. The seasonal festivals that mark the turning of the year provide the most systematic preservation of pagan wisdom within Christian culture, creating regular opportunities for communities to maintain relationships with natural forces that official theology declares non-existent. Halloween transforms Samhain, the Celtic New Year that marked the time when the veil between worlds grew thin, into a children's celebration that nonetheless preserves essential elements of the original ritual observance. The jack-o'-lantern that grins from front porches carries within its flickering flame the memory of the sacred fires that once guided ancestral spirits back to their earthly homes, that served as beacons for souls traveling between dimensions, that marked the doorways where living and dead could meet without harm to either. The carved faces may be grotesque rather than divine, but they continue to serve the same function, acknowledging the presence of otherworldly beings, whose goodwill must be maintained through proper recognition. The trick-or-treat tradition preserves the ancient practice of offering hospitality to supernatural visitors, whose appearance might be deceptive, whose true nature might not be immediately apparent, whose blessings or curses depended on the quality of reception they received from mortals. The children who demand candy in exchange for not playing tricks reenact the eternal relationship between human communities and spiritual forces that require acknowledgement, respect, and appropriate offerings to maintain their protective rather than destructive aspects. Even the costumes that transform neighborhood children into monsters and demons serve the ancient function of allowing ordinary people to embody archetypal energies safely, to experience what it feels like to be the witch or vampire or werewolf, to explore aspects of identity that normal social roles do not permit. The child who spends Halloween night as a ghost learns something about the persistence of consciousness beyond bodily death. The teenager who dresses as a vampire discovers the appeal of eternal life purchased at the cost of ordinary human relationships. Christmas preserves perhaps the most complete synthesis of Christian and pagan elements, creating a celebration that honors the birth of Christ while maintaining essential features of the winter solstice festivals that mark the return of light to the darkening world. The evergreen tree that stands in Christian homes carries lights like the world tree that connected heaven to earth in Norse cosmology, its branches reaching towards stars that remember when gods walked among mortals. The figure of Santa Claus embodies multiple layers of mythological preservation. His Christian identity as Saint Nicholas, the bishop who gave gifts to the poor and protected children from harm, overlays but does not entirely conceal his deeper connections to Woden, the All-Father who rode an 8-legged horse through winter skies and knew the secret names of all who dwelt beneath his wide-brimmed hat. The reindeer that pull his sleigh remember the sacred animals that carried gods between worlds. The chimney that provides access to every home echoes the world tree that connected all realms of existence. Most tellingly, Santa's workshop at the North Pole recreates the divine realm where supernatural beings labor to provide mortals with gifts that cannot be purchased in ordinary markets, where wishes become reality through magic that operates according to moral rather than economic principles, where good behavior is rewarded and bad behavior is noted, but rarely punished with anything worse than coal in the stocking. The tradition of leaving milk and cookies for Santa preserves the ancient practice of offering food to visiting spirits, of maintaining reciprocal relationships with supernatural beings whose generosity requires acknowledgement, even when their gifts appear to be freely given. The children who participate in these exchanges learn the fundamental principle that governs all relationships with divine powers, that receiving requires giving. that blessings must be acknowledged, that even gods appreciate expressions of gratitude from those they serve. May Day celebrations maintain the fertility festivals that honored the sacred marriage between earth and sky, the divine union whose consummation ensured the renewal of life after winter's death. The maypole around which dancers weave their ribbons represents the cosmic axis that connects all levels of existence. The world tree, whose roots reach into the underworld and whose branches support the heavens. The May Queen, who rules the celebration, carries within her flower crown the memory of every goddess who embodied the earth's creative power, who blessed the fertility of fields and flocks through her own symbolic marriage to the powers that govern seasonal change. The Morris dancers, who leap and cavort around the maypole, embody the wild energy that spring unleashes, the life force that breaks through winter's restraints like flowers forcing their way through frozen ground. Their bells and ribbons, their painted faces and ritual combat recreate the ancient ceremonies that channeled seasonal energies constructively, rather than allowing them to manifest randomly as chaos and destruction. But perhaps the most sophisticated preservation occurs in the realm of women's traditions, where knowledge that was too dangerous to speak openly found refuge in the activities that patriarchal culture dismissed as merely domestic, merely decorative, merely the harmless pastimes of creatures whose minds were considered incapable of serious thought. The spinning songs that accompanied the production of thread and cloth carried within their rhythmic verses the creation myths that explained how the universe was woven from the thoughts of goddesses, how fate was spun from the interactions between divine wills, how individual lives were threads in larger patterns that connected all beings in webs of mutual dependence. The herb gardens that women tended behind their cottages preserved pharmacological knowledge that stretched back to times when healing was considered a sacred art rather than a mechanical science, when plants were understood to be allies rather than resources, when the relationship between healer and patient was mediated by spiritual forces that required acknowledgement and respect. The recipes that passed from mother to daughter included not just botanical information, but ritual instructions, not just chemical knowledge, but spiritual wisdom about the proper relationship between human need and natural response. The birth traditions that surrounded the arrival of new children maintained connections to goddess mysteries that honored the creative power that flows through female bodies, that recognized childbirth as a sacred threshold where souls enter physical existence, that required protection and blessing from spiritual forces whose assistance could mean the difference between life and death for both mother and child. The songs that were sung during labor, the herbs that were burned to ease pain, the charms that were placed around cribs to ward off harmful influences, all preserved fragments of the great goddess traditions that once celebrated the feminine creative principle as the source of all existence. The food traditions that marked seasonal celebrations and family milestones carried within their seemingly simple preparations the memory of ritual feasts that established communion between human communities and divine powers. The special breads that were baked for particular occasions contained ingredients that were chosen not just for flavor, but for symbolic meaning, shapes that reflected cosmological understanding, timing that aligned with natural cycles that governed the flow of spiritual energy. There were sailing ceremonies that blessed apple trees in English orchards, preserved the understanding that plants possess spirits that require recognition and encouragement, that successful agriculture depends on maintaining relationships with the intelligences that govern growth and harvest, that the boundary between cultivation and magic is thinner than rational farming assumes. The wassailers who sang to sleeping trees and poured cider on their roots continued practices that stretched back to times when every grove was sacred, every harvest was a gift from gods, every meal was communion with forces larger than human hunger. But folklore preserves not just individual traditions, but entire ways of understanding the relationship between human consciousness and the larger patterns that govern existence. The fairy tales that survive in oral tradition operate according to psychological and spiritual laws that rational discourse cannot accommodate, that reveal truths about the nature of transformation, the price of wisdom, the relationship between desire and consequence, that no amount of theological instruction can convey as effectively as story. The hero, who must complete 3 tasks before winning the princess, learns that authentic achievement requires persistence through multiple stages of development, that superficial success is not sufficient for lasting transformation, that the greatest rewards come to those who can integrate different types of challenges, rather than excelling in only one area. The youngest son, who succeeds where his older brothers fail, demonstrates that conventional wisdom and social advantage are not reliable guides to spiritual success, that the qualities that society values most highly may be obstacles rather than assets in the quest for authentic fulfillment. The magical objects that appear in fairy tales, the 7-league boots that allow instantaneous travel, the cloak of invisibility that permits movement between worlds, the sword that cannot be broken by earthly force, represent spiritual capacities that become available to consciousness that has learned to operate according to archetypal rather than merely personal principles. They are not fantasy rewards, but symbols of psychological achievements that transform the individual's relationship to time and space, visibility and power, conflict and resolution. The talking animals that serve as helpers and advisors preserve the animistic consciousness that recognized intelligence in non-human forms, that maintained relationships with the spirits that inhabit natural phenomena, that understood wisdom as emerging from the intersection between human awareness and the larger intelligence that governs ecological systems. The fox who offers cunning, the eagle who provides perspective, the horse who supplies strength and speed, all represent aspects of consciousness that become available when the ego learns to collaborate with, rather than dominate, the instinctual wisdom that connects individual awareness to collective knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, folklore preserves the understanding that reality itself is more flexible than official doctrine admits, that consciousness can influence circumstances through means that rational analysis cannot explain, that the universe responds to certain approaches and attitudes in ways that suggest intelligence and intention rather than mere mechanical causation. The magic that pervades fairy tales is not supernatural intervention, but natural law, operating according to principles that materialist science has forgotten how to recognize. The words that have power to transform situations, the gestures that open doorways between worlds, the offerings that secure supernatural assistance, all reflect authentic technologies for interacting with dimensions of reality that become invisible when consciousness limits itself to purely physical categories. The folk traditions that preserve such knowledge maintain access to resources that may become essential when conventional approaches prove inadequate to meet the challenges that face human communities. Carl Jung recognized that fairy tales preserve archetypal wisdom in forms that remain accessible to consciousness, even when formal religious instruction fails to convey spiritual truth effectively. The symbols and narratives that appear spontaneously in dreams and active imagination sessions often parallel the motifs that appear in folklore from cultures around the world, suggesting that these stories preserve universal patterns rather than merely local customs. Modern therapeutic approaches that use fairy tales as diagnostic and healing tools recognize that individuals often unconsciously identify with particular story patterns that reflect their psychological situation, their developmental challenges, their potential for transformation. The client who resonates with Cinderella may be struggling with issues of recognition and self-worth. The person drawn to Beauty and the Beast stories may be learning to see past superficial appearances to deeper truths. The individual who connects with tales of youngest sons or daughters may be exploring themes of initiation and becoming. But folklore serves not just individual healing, but cultural survival, preserving knowledge that may become essential when dominant paradigms prove inadequate to address changing circumstances. The environmental crisis that threatens planetary ecosystems can be understood as the inevitable result of losing the animistic consciousness that recognized spiritual presence in natural phenomena, that maintained relationships with the intelligences that govern ecological balance, that understood human welfare as dependent on the welfare of the more than human community. The revival of interest in indigenous wisdom traditions, in permaculture and sustainable agriculture, in herbal medicine and natural healing, represents the return of consciousness that folklore never entirely abandoned. The people who learn to read the signs that predict weather changes, who plant by lunar phases, who harvest according to seasonal rhythms, rediscover technologies that oral tradition maintained through centuries when official culture dismissed such knowledge as primitive superstition. The story changes in the telling, but the truth survives the lie. In kitchen conversations and bedtime stories, in seasonal celebrations and family traditions, in the quiet practices that connect human lives to natural cycles and spiritual rhythms, the old wisdom persists beneath the surface of modern civilization. It waits with the patience of seeds in winter soil, of stories in grandmother's memory, of truths too essential to die even when empires declare them false. The old woman spins her wool and spins her words, and both threads connect present moment to past wisdom, individual experience to collective memory, conscious knowledge to unconscious truth. The children listen without knowing they are learning rebellion, without understanding they are receiving inheritance, without recognizing they are becoming the carriers of flame that has burned since human consciousness first learned to see the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the temporal, the divine in the forms that love takes when it moves through the world, seeking recognition, acceptance, and the chance to transform everything it touches into something more beautiful than logic alone could ever create. The mask slips, and beneath the monster's face lies a mirror. In the consultation room where shadows gather like forgotten prayers, the patient speaks in whispers about dreams that wake her screaming, visions that bleed through daylight hours, encounters with beings that should not exist but persist in appearing whenever consciousness relaxes its guard against the impossible. She describes a figure with goat's legs and human torso, eyes that burn with ancient knowledge, horns that branch towards stars she has never seen, but somehow recognizes as the lights that guided her ancestors through darkness older than civilization. "It speaks to me," she whispers, her hands trembling as they trace patterns in the air that her rational mind insists are meaningless, but her deeper awareness knows as sacred geometry, as the language that reality uses when it wishes to communicate with souls brave enough to listen. "It tells me things about myself, about the world, about what we've forgotten. But it's evil, isn't it? That's what I've been taught. That's what the dreams must mean. That I'm being tempted by Satan, that my soul is in danger, that I should resist these visitations with every weapon that faith provides." The therapist leans forward, her training in depth psychology warring with cultural conditioning that insists some experiences must be pathologized rather than explored. Some visitations must be medicated rather than integrated. Some encounters with the unknown must be eliminated rather than understood. She has read Jung's accounts of his own relationship with figures that appeared from the collective unconscious, has studied the shamanic traditions that recognize such beings as allies rather than enemies, has witnessed the healing that can occur when individuals learn to dialogue with the archetypal powers that emerge from the depths of the psyche. "Tell me," she says carefully, "what does this being actually do? Does it harm you, threaten you, make demands that feel destructive or malevolent? Or does it teach, guide, reveal aspects of yourself that you hadn't previously recognized?" The question hangs in the air like incense, like the smoke that rises from offerings left at crossroads where three paths meet, like the mist that forms when two worlds touch, and the boundary between known and unknown becomes permeable to traffic that flows both ways. For in this moment, in this room, in this conversation, the ancient dialogue resumes between human consciousness and the archetypal powers that have always sought recognition, integration, conscious relationship, rather than fearful rejection. This is where the great reversal begins, in the recognition that what we call evil is often just unfamiliar, that what we label demonic may actually be divine wearing faces we have been taught not to recognize, that the monsters we flee in terror may be the very teachers we most desperately need to help us become whole, authentic, genuinely alive, rather than merely existing in the narrow confines of what official culture declares acceptable. The patient's description of her horned visitor reveals none of the classic signs of genuinely malevolent presence. No demand for worship or submission, no attempt to isolate her from healthy relationships, no encouragement toward destructive behaviors that would harm herself or others. Instead, the being appears to offer what the ancient fertility gods always provided: connection to natural rhythms, integration of civilized and wild aspects of personality, recognition of the sacred dimension that flows through physical existence. "It shows me forests," she continues, her voice gaining strength as she speaks truths that have been locked in silence for months of fearful resistance. Not threatening forests, but welcoming ones. Trees that seem to recognize me, streams that call my name, clearings where I could rest without fear. It tells me that I've forgotten how to breathe, how to move, how to be present in my own body. It suggests that the anxiety I've struggled with for years comes from trying to live according to rules that contradict my deepest nature, from attempting to fit into roles that require me to deny essential aspects of who I am. The therapist makes notes, but also listens with the part of her awareness that recognizes the wisdom that can emerge from sources beyond rational understanding. She has worked with enough clients to know that healing often requires relationship with dimensions of the psyche that cannot be accessed through conscious intention alone, that the figures who appear in dreams and active imagination possess knowledge and perspective that the ego consciousness cannot generate independently. Carl Jung's encounter with his own archetypal figures, Philemon, the wise old man who taught him about the autonomous nature of psychic contents, Salome, the anima figure who embodied the dangerous but necessary feminine principle, the Red One, who appeared in visions with distinctly demonic characteristics but served essentially therapeutic functions, established the foundation for understanding these experiences as encounters with aspects of the self that have been split off from conscious awareness and must be reintegrated for psychological wholeness. But Jung's insights remain controversial precisely because they challenge the fundamental assumption that underlies both religious and psychiatric approaches to unusual experiences. The assumption that any spiritual encounter that occurs outside official channels must be either delusional or demonic, either a symptom of mental illness or evidence of supernatural malevolence. The possibility that such experiences might represent contact with legitimate sources of wisdom and healing that operate according to laws different from, but not necessarily opposed to those that govern ordinary consciousness, remains largely unexplored by mainstream therapeutic approaches. The terror that grips individuals who encounter archetypal figures stems not from the inherent nature of these beings, but from cultural conditioning that has taught us to fear any spiritual presence that does not bear the explicit approval of established religious authorities. The horned god, who appears in dreams and visions, carries within his transformed appearance the accumulated projections of centuries of demonization. The theological burden of being declared the enemy of all that is holy, despite his original function as the divine masculine principle that blessed fertility, growth, and the integration of human and natural consciousness. Modern horror literature and cinema reveal the same pattern of projection and misrecognition on a collective scale. The monsters that populate contemporary entertainment are often distorted reflections of archetypal energies that have been driven underground by cultural repression, spiritual forces whose legitimate needs for recognition and relationship have been denied for so long that they can only emerge through the vocabulary of fear, violence, and supernatural threat. The vampire who seduces victims through erotic attraction, embodies the return of the repressed life force that has been denied legitimate expression through healthy sexuality, creative work, and passionate engagement with existence. The bloodthirst that defines the vampire's nature represents not inherent evil, but the desperation of vital energy that has been cut off from its natural sources of nourishment. Authentic intimacy, meaningful work, connection to beauty and mystery that makes existence feel worth living rather than merely enduring. Bram Stoker's Dracula, the archetypal literary vampire, carries within his monstrous form multiple layers of cultural anxiety about forces that Victorian society could not consciously integrate. His aristocratic bearing and ancient nobility reflect the return of pagan spiritual authority that Christianity thought it had successfully eliminated. His ability to transform into animals embodies the shamanic consciousness that recognizes kinship between human and non-human intelligence. His immortality represents the aspect of the psyche that refuses to accept the limitations that rational materialism imposes on human possibility. But most significantly, Dracula's need for blood reflects the hunger for authentic life that arises when consciousness has been so thoroughly domesticated that it no longer knows how to access the sources of vitality that make existence feel meaningful rather than merely mechanical. The vampire who preys upon others because he cannot generate life force independently represents the psychological state that develops when individuals become disconnected from their own creative and regenerative capacities. The therapeutic approach that recognizes vampiric symptoms, chronic fatigue, emotional numbness, the sense of being drained by relationships and responsibilities, as signs of spiritual disconnection rather than medical pathology, opens possibilities for healing that address root causes rather than merely managing symptoms. The individual who learns to reconnect with sources of authentic nourishment, creative expression, time in nature, relationships that support growth rather than demanding compliance, often discovers that the vampiric hunger disappears as legitimate needs are met through healthy channels. The werewolf tradition reveals similar patterns of cultural projection and therapeutic possibility. The individual who transforms into a beast under the full moon embodies the return of instinctual wisdom that has been suppressed by excessive civilization. The wild self that emerges when rational control relaxes and deeper layers of consciousness become accessible. The transformation that occurs beyond conscious control reflects the psychological truth that integration of shadow aspects of personality cannot be achieved through willpower alone, but requires surrender to processes that operate according to rhythms deeper than ego intention. The horror that surrounds werewolf transformation stems from cultural fear of the animal nature that lurks within human consciousness. The recognition that civilized behavior is a relatively thin veneer over instinctual drives that can emerge with destructive force when they are denied recognition and healthy expression. But indigenous traditions that honored shape-shifting warriors understood such transformations as achievements rather than afflictions, signs of spiritual advancement rather than demonic possession. The modern men's movement that seeks to reclaim the wild man archetype represents an attempt to heal the split between civilized and instinctual masculinity that werewolf mythology both reflects and perpetuates. The workshops and retreats where men gather to drum, dance, tell stories, and explore warrior energy in supportive contexts provide safe containers for engaging with aspects of masculine nature that have been demonized by cultures that demand complete domestication of male aggression and sexuality. The success of such approaches suggests that what we call monstrous transformation may actually be botched attempts at necessary psychological integration, shadow work that emerges in pathological forms when it cannot find healthy expression through conscious choice and therapeutic support. The man who learns to honor his inner warrior through constructive channels, physical challenge, creative competition, protective service to community, often discovers that the rage and violence that once seemed uncontrollable become sources of strength and vitality when properly channeled. The jinn traditions of the Middle East offer perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of how to maintain relationships with spiritual beings, whose nature transcends simple categories of good and evil. In pre-Islamic Arabian culture, jinn were recognized as autonomous entities with their own agendas, intelligence levels that could equal or exceed human capacity, and moral systems that operated according to principles that did not necessarily align with human values, but were not inherently antagonistic to human welfare. The key to successful relationship with jinn lay in recognizing their fundamental otherness while maintaining respectful communication that acknowledged their legitimate interests and capabilities. The human who approached jinn with arrogance or attempts at coercion invariably encountered difficulties, but those who offered appropriate respect and negotiated mutually beneficial relationships could receive assistance that transcended ordinary human limitations. Modern therapeutic approaches that work with inner guides or spirit allies often rediscover principles that jinn traditions took for granted, that the psyche contains autonomous intelligences that possess knowledge and perspective beyond the reach of conscious ego awareness, that these entities respond to respectful approach but resist attempts at domination or manipulation, that healing often requires collaboration with inner figures whose wisdom emerges from sources deeper than personal experience, the client who learns to dialogue with the inner critic, the inner child, the inner wise woman or wise man, often discovers that these psychological complexes possess coherent personalities, consistent preferences, and access to information that the conscious mind cannot generate independently. The therapeutic relationship that honors such figures as legitimate aspects of the self, rather than mere projections or fantasies, opens possibilities for healing that remain unavailable when treatment focuses exclusively on rational analysis and behavioral modification. But perhaps the most profound shift occurs when individuals begin to recognize that the spiritual beings who appear in dreams, visions, and altered states of consciousness may represent contact with dimensions of reality that extend beyond the boundaries of individual psychology. The shamanic traditions that form the oldest continuous spiritual practices in human history were built on the understanding that consciousness is not confined within the skull, but participates in larger webs of awareness that include non-human intelligence, ancestral wisdom, and ecological knowledge that emerges from relationship with the more than human world. The environmental crisis that threatens planetary ecosystems can be understood as the inevitable result of losing connection with the spiritual intelligences that govern natural systems, the guardian spirits whose warnings about ecological imbalance have been dismissed as primitive superstition rather than recognized as sophisticated environmental monitoring from sources that possess perspective unavailable to purely human observation. The climate scientists who document the accelerating collapse of biodiversity often express frustration that their data fails to motivate the behavioral changes necessary to address the crisis they document. But data alone cannot provide the emotional and spiritual motivation necessary for the fundamental transformation of consciousness that environmental healing requires. Such transformation may require reconnection with the archetypal powers that once taught humans to see themselves as participants in rather than masters of the natural world. The return of shamanic practices in contemporary culture, vision quests, plant medicine ceremonies, drumming circles, wilderness therapy, represents not romantic primitivism, but desperate necessity. The recognition that technological civilization has reached limits that cannot be transcended through more technology, more rational analysis, more attempts to control natural systems through human will and scientific understanding. The individuals who seek healing through such approaches often report encounters with spiritual beings who provide guidance that proves practically useful, insights about dietary changes that resolve chronic health problems, understanding of relationship patterns that enables more authentic intimacy, perspective on life direction that clarifies vocational confusion, connection to sources of meaning that address existential despair. Whether such beings are understood as psychological projections or autonomous spiritual entities matters less than the practical results they produce and the healing they facilitate. The neo-pagan movements that have emerged since the 1960s represent systematic attempts to restore conscious relationship with the archetypal powers that once provided spiritual guidance for human communities. The practitioners of Wicca, Asatru, Druidry, and dozens of other reconstructed traditions do not necessarily believe in literal gods and goddesses, but recognize these figures as symbols of natural forces and psychological energies that require conscious relationship for both individual and collective well-being. The seasonal celebrations that mark the turning of the year, the rituals that honor birth and death, and the transitions between life stages, the magical practices that seek to align human will with larger patterns of meaning and purpose, all represent technologies for maintaining the kinds of relationships with archetypal forces that folklore preserved in disguised form through centuries of official suppression. The effectiveness of such practices can be measured not by their conformity to rational materialism, but by their practical results, the sense of meaning and connection they provide, the healing they facilitate, the communities they create, the environmental consciousness they foster. The individuals who participate in neo-pagan traditions often report improvements in psychological well-being, physical health, relationship satisfaction, and vocational fulfillment that suggest these practices address needs that conventional religion and secular psychology leave unmet. But the most significant development may be the growing recognition that the division between primitive and advanced spiritual practices reflects cultural prejudice rather than objective evaluation of effectiveness. The shamanic techniques that indigenous cultures refined over millennia often prove more successful at treating conditions like depression, anxiety, addiction, and trauma than approaches based on purely rational analysis of symptoms and causes. The ayahuasca ceremonies that have gained popularity in contemporary healing contexts demonstrate how plant medicines can provide access to dimensions of consciousness that conventional therapy cannot reach, facilitating encounters with archetypal figures that offer perspectives on personal and collective healing that emerge from sources beyond individual psychology. The participants who work with such medicines often report contact with entities that seem to possess autonomous intelligence, healing knowledge that proves practically applicable, and wisdom about the relationship between human consciousness and ecological systems that conventional education does not provide. Whether such entities are understood as aspects of the unconscious mind or as genuine spiritual beings from parallel dimensions matters less than their capacity to facilitate healing, provide guidance, and restore the sense of connection to larger sources of meaning that technological civilization has systematically undermined. The therapeutic value of such encounters suggests that what we call supernatural may actually be natural phenomena that operate according to laws that materialist science has not yet learned to recognize or measure. The integration of shamanic and psychological approaches represents a return to older understandings of healing that recognize the interconnection between individual consciousness and the larger spiritual ecology that governs both personal and collective well-being. The therapist who learns to work with archetypal figures, the physician who incorporates energy healing techniques, the educator who recognizes the spiritual dimension of learning, all participate in the restoration of approaches to human development that honor the full spectrum of human nature rather than limiting treatment to rational and behavioral interventions. The mask slips, and beneath the monster's face lies a mirror that reflects not demonic corruption, but forgotten divinity, not supernatural threat, but natural wisdom, not evil that must be destroyed, but unfamiliarity that requires patient understanding and skillful integration. The beings we fear in dreams and visions, the entities we encounter in altered states, the figures who emerge from the depths of the psyche during times of crisis and transition, these are often the very teachers we most need to help us become whole. The patient in the consultation room learns to dialogue with her horned visitor rather than fleeing in terror, discovers that his apparent demands are actually invitations, recognizes that his fierce appearance conceals compassionate intention. She begins to understand that the anxiety she has struggled with for years stems not from demonic possession, but from disconnection from aspects of her own nature that seek integration rather than elimination. As she learns to honor the wild wisdom that speaks through archetypal forms, to trust the body's intelligence that operates through instinctual rather than rational channels, to recognize the sacred dimension that reveals itself in dreams and synchronicities and moments of profound beauty, her symptoms begin to resolve in ways that medication and behavioral therapy alone could never accomplish. The transformation occurs not through exorcism, but through recognition, not through resistance, but through relationship, not through the victory of light over darkness, but through the integration of opposites that have been artificially separated by theological systems too narrow to contain the full mystery of human existence. She discovers that what she called evil was actually just unfamiliar, that what she feared as supernatural was actually natural wisdom wearing unfamiliar forms, that what she interpreted as demonic temptation was actually divine invitation to remember what her ancestors knew, that consciousness participates in webs of relationship that extend far beyond the boundaries of individual identity, that healing requires dialogue with forces larger than personal will, that wholeness emerges from the marriage of all the aspects of reality that dualistic thinking attempts to keep forever separate. The monsters become teachers, the demons become allies. The evil becomes revelation of good that has been so long suppressed it could only appear in forms that seemed threatening until they were met with the courage that transforms fear into wisdom, resistance into relationship, rejection into recognition of the divine complexity that encompasses all existence in its beautiful, terrible, endlessly creative embrace. When we listen to our monsters, when we approach them with respect rather than terror, curiosity rather than condemnation, willingness to learn rather than determination to destroy, we discover that they are often the very gods we need, wearing the only faces that could penetrate the defenses we have built against the mystery that calls to us from the depths of our own forgotten nature, demanding not submission, but partnership in the great work of becoming fully alive.